The lamps along the Seine flicker, their reflections trembling on water the color of lead. Somewhere beneath the bridge, a violin plays too slowly, its notes warped, dissolving into the fog that never truly leaves this city. The night smells of rain, tobacco, and ether, a perfume of dreams and decay. In the narrow streets, silhouettes drift like ghosts between the glow of absinthe bars and the hush of shuttered ateliers. The war has ended, but the fever never did. Men with haunted eyes and women wrapped in fox fur stumble through the aftermath searching for something to feel or to forget. It is Paris, 1924, the city of art, of decadence, of lost innocence. Behind the shimmer of champagne glasses, spoons burn silver over candlelight. Powder falls like snow onto mirrors, needles gleam beside paintbrushes and poetry. In Montparnasse, they whisper about la fleur blanche, the white flower, heroin, the muse that kills softly. It seeps through every studio, every cafe, every pulse. The artists call it inspiration, the poets call it freedom, the city calls it love. But it is neither. It is something colder, something that tastes like glass and leaves behind a heartbeat that never quite stops echoing. The beauty of Paris becomes its sickness. The jazz is too fast, the laughter too loud, the colors too bright. You can feel it, the slow unraveling behind every painted smile, every trembling hand clutching a glass. The city is still alive, but barely. Some say it was liberation. Others, the aftershock of a generation that saw too much and felt even more. But when the night stretches too long and the powder begins to glow beneath the lamplight, you start to wonder, was this ever a dream at all? Stay close now. Don't look away. Tonight, we enter the dream that devoured a generation, the death of Paris, inside the 1920s heroin boom. The war had ended, but the nights had only just begun. Paris in 1920 was a body that refused to rest, fevered, glittering, and too alive for its own good. The cafes along the boulevard du Montparnasse pulsed like veins after midnight, their windows glowing amber through the fog. Inside, laughter clattered like cutlery, sharp and desperate, as if everyone were terrified of the quiet. The air smelled of tobacco and perfume, of coal smoke and wine. Every sound, every sigh echoed the same truth. No one wanted to remember what silence had sounded like in the trenches. The Seine moved sluggishly beneath its bridges, black and indifferent, carrying the reflections of a city that pretended it had forgotten. The soldiers had returned, or rather, what was left of them. Some wore medals on their jackets, others wore scars that no one dared name. They filled the benches of the left bank, hollow-eyed and shaking, murmuring to themselves in the language of artillery and ghosts. At night, they crowded into the bars with the students, and one for poets, men who had read Nietzsche, but not the names on the graves. Paris had become a theater of survival, where everyone played their part to keep the curtain from falling. The lights never went out anymore, even in the narrow alleys of Montmartre. Lanterns burned until dawn, haloed in cigarette smoke. Sleep felt like a weakness, a luxury for those who hadn't seen what the war could do to dreams. The cafes turned into confessionals where no one listened. The painters drank absinthe by the bottle, declaring the death of reason. The poets ranted about the new gods, speed, sin, and sensation. Women with bobbed hair and crimson lips smoked in defiance of everything their mothers had taught them. It was said that Paris had gone mad, but in truth, it was simply awake, too awake to bear its own memory. And in that sleepless city, a new shadow began to stir. It drifted through the chemists' shops, hidden behind Latin labels and polite smiles. Doctors prescribed it freely, white powder finer than sugar, cheaper than peace. They called it heroin, a miracle of modern science, a gift for pain. No one asked which kind. A pinch dissolved in wine, a spoon warmed over candlelight, and the restlessness faded. The trembling stopped. The city's pulse slowed to something almost human. At first, it was the soldiers who needed it most. Then came the dancers with ruined feet, the writers with shaking hands, the lovers who couldn't bear the morning light. It promised them sleep, not the ordinary kind, but the kind that erased the noise, the hunger, the years they'd lost. Paris took it in like air. Behind every curtain, a sigh. Behind every sigh, a secret. By the time the bells of Notre Dame rang in the new decade, the city was no longer celebrating. It was floating slowly, beautifully, into its own oblivion. The city of light had found a new way to dream, and no one noticed the smell of death drifting softly beneath the scent of jasmine and rain. The river carried secrets now. They drifted beneath its bridges like whispers, slow, heavy, and silvered by the pale light of dawn. From the quays, one could smell the faint sweetness that clung to the water, a scent both familiar and strange. Tobacco, soot, and something sharper, metallic, almost medicinal. Paris had learned to disguise decay as perfume. The factories along the outskirts worked day and night, filling the lungs of the city with their exhaust. But this smoke was different. It did not rise from chimneys, it came from mouths, from spoons, from trembling hands that chased silence through the veins. Morning in the left bank no longer meant clarity. The fog never quite lifted. It lingered, tinted gold and grey, draping over the rooftops like exhaustion. Street sweepers moved slowly through it, their brooms whispering against the cobblestones. Newspapers lay soaked in gutter water, headlines promising progress, recovery, rebirth. But those who lived in the cafes and cellars knew better. Beneath the triumphant words of politicians, another city pulsed, a quieter, hungrier one, ruled not by kings or presidents, but by need. The cafes along Rue de la Gaîté filled before noon. Painters, poets, and prostitutes shared tables like family, each cup of coffee stretched as far as the francs would allow. In one corner, a violinist tuned his instrument with fingers that shook from withdrawal. In another, a journalist scribbled about a new dawn for Europe, pausing every few lines to sip from a flask. Outside, the posters promised the années folles, the crazy years, but even madness had a rhythm now, one measured in doses. On the Pont Neuf, a woman in a velvet hat leaned against the railing, her breath fogging the air. She hummed a song that no one recognized, the same few notes repeated endlessly, as if caught in a loop. Her purse carried little more than a mirror, a packet of powder, and a photograph folded until the faces had faded. When she tilted her head, the river below seemed to shimmer like mercury. By nightfall, she would not remember standing there at all. In Montmartre, the smoke thickened as dusk fell. The cabarets opened their doors, releasing bursts of laughter and perfume into the street. Behind the curtains, waiters carried trays of champagne and candlelight, stepping carefully between tables where the city's lost generation held court. They spoke of art, of peace, of Freud and Nietzsche, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They wanted numbness, not meaning. The heroine came quietly, wrapped in innocence, a medical miracle turned muse, a dab on the tongue before a performance, a pinch in the arm after a painting. The lines between creation and oblivion blurred until no one cared which side they stood on. By midnight, the Seine was veiled in its own reflection, smoke drifting across smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang for the dead, though no one knew whose name it carried. The city listened, for a moment, then exhaled, sending another cloud into the cold Paris air. Beneath the bridges, the river shivered, heavy with secrets it could never wash away. They came home in silence, not the silence of peace, but of disbelief. Men who had outlived the world they were promised. The war had ended, the papers said, yet every train that arrived at Gare de l'Est carried soldiers who no longer recognized the word. They stepped onto the platform with eyes too old for their faces, the medals on their coats dulled by dust. Some limped, others stared straight ahead, walking like men half remembering how to move. Paris had hung flags for them, bright ribbons and tricolors fluttering from balconies, but the wounded saw only ghosts in the crowd. their own shapes reflected in the windows of shops selling perfumes, hats, and cigarettes. Hospitals overflowed. The Hôtel des Invalides, once a monument to military glory, became a warehouse of ruin. Inside, nurses moved like pale shadows through rows of iron beds, whispering instructions no one could follow. The smell of antiseptic hung thick in the corridors, a cruel perfume that mingled with morphine. At night, the moans rose and fell like waves. Some begged for sleep, others begged not to wake again. And when the doctors ran out of patients, they reached for bottles marked diacetyl morphine, Bayer's latest gift to modern medicine. "Just a pinch," they said. "It will ease the nerves." For the first time in years, the soldiers felt something close to peace. The pain softened, the tremors stopped, the gunfire in their minds dulled to a whisper. They closed their eyes and saw the fields not as they were torn, cratered, black, but as they had been before. Green, endless, almost merciful. The doctors called it progress. The patients called it sleep. But the sleep did not end. When the doses ran out, the shaking returned worse than before. Some sold their medals for another vial. Others wandered to the chemists' shops that had quietly begun to sell heroin over the counter, labeled simply as a cough remedy or tonic. In the cafes near the Gare du Nord, one could see them by the dozen, men with their sleeves rolled up, staring into cups of coffee gone cold, waiting for the trembling to stop. Paris wanted to believe they had healed. There were parades, speeches, and dances held in their honor. The newspapers printed photographs of smiling veterans shaking hands with generals. But behind the smiles were teeth ground down by nightmares. When the photographers left, many of those same men returned to their rented rooms, locked the door, and drew the curtains tight. There, the silence became unbearable again. The white powder waited on the nightstand, promising one more hour of peace. By 1921, more veterans were dying in their beds than had on the front lines. Not from bullets, but from the very medicine meant to save them. Heroin became the final wound of the Great War, invisible and unspoken. The city that had celebrated their return now turned its face away, unwilling to see what survival had cost. And in the stillness of those rooms, beneath the hum of the city that refused to sleep, the soldiers slipped quietly into the same darkness they had once fought to escape. At first, they were just shops, narrow and neat, with polished windows and brass lettering that caught the morning light. Pharmacie Centrale, Pharmacie du Palais Royal, Pharmacie Saint-Michel. Their glass jars gleamed with powders of every shade, amber for digestion, lilac for nerves, white for pain. To the passer-by, they were places of trust, sanctuaries of science, where sickness went in and relief came out. But inside, behind the counters lined with marble and mahogany, a quiet revolution of forgetting was already underway. It began innocently enough. The war had left millions broken, not visibly wounded, but frayed from within. Doctors needed something stronger than morphine, something purer, something that could make a man forget without killing him. When Bayer introduced their new compound, diacetyl morphine, the chemists in Paris embraced it like gospel. It was tasteless, odorless, and most importantly legal. The newspapers called it the modern miracle, a cure for nerves, insomnia, melancholy, and the moral exhaustion of modern life. By 1921, every pharmacy had its own clientele of dreamers. Housewives came with prescriptions for fatigue that never seemed to end. Poets and painters arrived without them, trading sketches or promises for tiny bottles wrapped in brown paper. Soldiers brought their medals to pawn for a single vial. Some pharmacies stayed open late, their lamps burning long past curfew, the bell over the door jingling softly into the early hours. Paris had learned that sleep could be sold by the gram. The ritual was always the same: a spoon, a flame, a whisper, steam rising like incense in a chapel of the damned. The first inhale felt like baptism. The world softened, the weight lifted, the heart stopped fighting itself. And in that gentle surrender, the city found a new form of worship. Heroin was not a drug, it was deliverance. Soon, it wasn't only the desperate who came. The fashionable arrived too, dancers from the Folies Bergère, actresses from the silent films, students with pocket money and a taste for rebellion. They didn't come to forget war, they came to forget boredom, to feel something purer than champagne, finer than music. They called it les sommeils blancs, the white sleep. In Montparnasse, they whispered that Picasso had tried it, that Hemingway had refused it, that Modigliani had died with it in his blood. By 1923, Parisian pharmacies had become confessional booths of the body. The chemists knew the regulars by name, their prescriptions written in careful disguise. The city's doctors had grown quiet, they knew the truth but also the profits. To question the habit was to lose clientele, and so the powders continued to flow, from the docks of Marseille to the boulevards of Saint-Germain, from trembling hands to trembling hearts. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame still rang, but fewer heads turned toward them. Faith had moved, indoors into bottles and needles, into private rituals performed behind locked doors. Paris no longer sought miracles from heaven. It found them instead on the counters of its corner shops, sweet, silent, and white as the first snowfall over the Seine. By the time the cafes began to fill with smoke and restless laughter, heroin had already taken on another name, La Muse Blanche, the White Muse. She drifted through Montparnasse like perfume, invisible yet unmistakable. Poets spoke of her in metaphors. Painters tried to trap her glow in oils. Musicians heard her in the pauses between notes. She was not advertised or sold, but summoned, whispered about in after-hours cafes where brilliance and ruin shared the same table. It was said that the White Muse didn't ask for worship, only surrender. She brought stillness to shaking hands and clarity to restless minds. To inhale her was to silence the world, the noise of trams, debts, deadlines, hunger all gone in a breath. For a moment, she made everything bearable. She gave the illusion of control, even as she quietly removed it. Artists who once burned with feverish energy began to move slower, to speak softer, to see differently. They described light as if it were liquid, color as if it bled. Their canvases grew strange, faces half-dreamed, bodies dissolving into mist. Critics called it genius. The White Muse called it the beginning. In a dim studio near Rue de la Grande Chaumière, the air smelled of turpentine and ether. Canvases leaned against the walls like abandoned windows. Their creator, a young man named Lucien Delorme, sat barefoot on the floor, eyes glazed in reverence. A needle rested beside his palette. His latest work showed a woman with no face, her body evaporating into white smoke. "She's not gone," he murmured when asked about her. "She's becoming." Within months, Lucien himself would vanish, leaving behind only the smell of linseed and a single unfinished canvas titled La Muse Blanche. The writers were no better. Their notebooks filled with half-sentences and smudged ink, their poems drenched in longing. They spoke of transcendence, of chasing the perfect word that hovered just beyond reach. Heroin slowed their croup, blood, sharpened their loneliness, and turned every sorrow into poetry. In cafes, their words floated like ash. "It isn't death," one of them said. "It's concentration." The Muse didn't discriminate. She visited the famous and the forgotten, the rich and the starving. One actress from the Odeon claimed she could feel the spotlight even when the stage was empty. "It makes you luminous," she told her friends, "like God is remembering you." They laughed and toasted her with absinthe. A week later she was gone, her reflection left in the mirror of her dressing room, cold and perfect. The city began to wear its brilliance like a mask. Behind every triumph lay a trembling hand, behind every masterpiece, a powder's trace. Yet no one spoke of addiction, only inspiration. Pain had become fashionable, suffering romantic. They said Paris was alive again, but the truth was simpler and more tragic. The city was dreaming while awake, and in that fever dream, the white, Muse watched over her disciples, patient as frost, waiting for the moment they mistook her silence for salvation. The cafes of Montparnasse glowed like lanterns in fog, each one a small universe of laughter, smoke, and trembling nerves. The war was over, the city proclaimed, but midnight in Paris still belonged to ghosts. You could feel them in the rhythm of footsteps along Boulevard Raspail, in the way music leaked from cellar doors, jazz from one, violins from another, and always that undercurrent of exhaustion disguised as joy. Artists, students, philosophers, and drifters crowded shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale in the candlelight, their eyes bright with the fever of survival. Inside La Rotonde, the air was thick enough to drink. A waiter passed with a tray of wine glasses, dodging an argument about Dadaism in one corner, and a painter reciting Baudelaire from memory in another. Someone played the piano off-key, the melody wandering, refusing to end. Every table had its characters: the poet who hadn't eaten in 2 days, the sculptor who had just sold his first piece, the journalist, taking notes on the decadence he secretly admired. They all lived as if each night were the last one before the light went out for good. In the back booth, a woman in a black dress leaned close to a young writer, whispering something only he could hear. Her laughter shimmered through the smoke, low, slow, and dangerous. A spoon flashed briefly between them, a candle flickered, and the moment passed. To anyone watching, it looked like flirtation. In truth, it was communion. The ritual of the White Muse had made its way here too. No one spoke of it, yet everyone knew. Heroin flowed through Montparnasse the way wine once had a social grace, a secret shared in trust. It was the fuel behind the city's brilliance, or so they told themselves. Under its spell, words came faster, colors deepened, pain turned to art, and when the ecstasy faded, there was always another vial, another night. The cafes never closed, and if they did, there was always a friend's room upstairs where the candles burned lower and the music softened. There, under yellow light, poets wrote verses they wouldn't remember, lovers promised forever to faces they couldn't name, and painters traced the outlines of angels who never came back. Outside, the streets were slick with rain and reflections. Street lamps glowed like molten halos. Strangers passed with the quiet urgency of dreamers not hurrying home, but hurrying away from something. The city had become its own narcotic, its rhythm too intoxicating to resist. Midnight belonged to those who could no longer tell whether they were alive or merely awake. Somewhere beyond the cafes, the bells of Saint-Germain tolled softly, almost apologetic. The wind carried the sound across the rooftops, over the river, through the narrow veins of alleys and courtyards. Few heard it, fewer cared. Montparnasse was still awake, its heart beating to the slow pulse of candlelight and smoke. And above it all, the White Muse drifted unseen, her shadow stretched across the city, whispering promises that sounded, to the desperate and the divine alike, exactly like love. When the first saxophones arrived from New Orleans, they sounded like rebellion. Their wail cut through the smoke-filled air of Montmartre and Montparnasse, sharp and alive, the anthem of a generation desperate to dance faster than its grief. Paris embraced jazz like an absolution. In the cellars beneath Rue Fontaine, the music began after midnight, when the city's wounds were most awake. Trumpets rose like laughter from a grave, drums beat out a new kind of heartbeat, wild, syncopated, lawless, and the people came, in silks and rags alike, to drown their memories in rhythm. At Le Boeuf-sur-le-Toit the air trembled with sound. The crowd swayed shoulder to shoulder, cigarette smoke twisting through the beams of light. Black musicians from America shared the stage with pale poets from France, their improvisations colliding in glorious confusion. Josephine Baker spun under the spotlight, her body glittering like wet bronze, her smile wide enough to hide a continent of pain. Men, in tuxedos, clapped too loudly. Women in pearls pretended not to cry. The war was supposed to be over, but every note of jazz said otherwise. For the veterans, it was the rhythm of forgetting the only language that matched the chaos in their heads. The drums echoed the pulse of gunfire, The bass hummed like the engines of war, yet in that noise there was freedom. For a few minutes, no one had to think. The heroine slipped easily into this world, quiet where jazz was loud, slow where jazz was fevered. One could take a dose, step into the light, and feel invincible. The combination became a ritual. The needle and the note, the rush and the release. Paris was learning to balance ecstasy on the edge of ruin. By 2 in the morning, the streets outside were slick with rain and sweat. Taxi horns mingled with saxophones, laughter with sirens. Lovers kissed under dripping awnings, their mouths tasting of wine and powder. Inside the clubs, bodies moved like smoke, not touching, but dissolving into one another. Time itself seemed to bend around the music. Hours vanished. Dawn came as an insult. Yet even amid the glitter and noise, the sorrow never left. It lingered behind the laughter, in the half-lit eyes of the performers, in the slumped shoulders of those who stayed after closing time. The musicians, exhausted, packed their instruments into cracked leather cases. The addicts gathered what little courage they had left and stepped out into the cold. Jazz was their disguise, a sound bright enough to make death look like dance. When the lights finally went out, the city exhaled in unison. The echo of trumpets drifted over the Seine, mixing with the morning mist. Somewhere a record skipped, repeating the same broken bar over and over, like a memory refusing to fade. Paris was quiet again, but not peaceful. Beneath the silence, the music still pulsed deep, aching, eternal, the heartbeat of a city that would rather die dancing than ever feel sober again. The white coats came to symbolize salvation. In the crowded wards of Sainte-Anne and Hôtel Dieu, physicians moved with quiet authority, stethoscopes dangling like talismans. Their voices were low, almost soothing, the way a priest's would be before confession. They had learned a new language since the war, one of pain management, of nerves and trauma, of invisible wounds. They spoke of neurasthenia and melancholic episodes. But what they really meant was despair. Paris was full of it. Every morning, the queues outside the clinics grew longer. Soldiers with trembling hands, women with hollow eyes, children too restless to sleep. The doctors could offer little beyond patience and morphine, until the German miracle appeared on their shelves: diacetyl morphine, sold under the gentle name heroin. The pamphlets promised purity, efficiency, and relief from even the most stubborn pain. It was Bayer's great gift to the world, and the world accepted it without hesitation. In the consultation rooms, the ritual unfolded with the precision of mass. The patient entered, the doctor asked the questions he already knew the answers to. You sleep poorly? You wake with anxiety? Your appetite has diminished? He would nod gravely, remove his spectacles, and write the word heroin in a looping script that turned suffering into something civilized. The prescription was small, polite, official. No one thought sin could come printed on fine paper with the physician's seal. Pharmacists filled the orders without question. Bottles left the counters wrapped in brown paper, labeled for nervous exhaustion or respiratory distress. Housewives tucked them into handbags between lipstick and rosaries. Men kept them in their coat pockets like lucky charms. Doctors soon discovered that the drug worked faster than talking, cost less than therapy, and kept patients quiet. The city's physicians became merchants of silence. By night, the same men who prescribed the cure became its users. In the apartments overlooking the Boulevard Saint-Germain, the lines blurred between medicine and ritual. A doctor might pour himself a small measure after dinner, dissolve the powder into cognac, and watch his own heartbeat slow. It was not addiction, he told himself, only research. But each night, the research lasted longer. A few resisted. Dr. Fournier, of the Hôpital de la Salpêtrière, wrote that the new drug strips away the will and leaves a shell. His warnings were dismissed as paranoia. Another physician, Dr. Tissot, refused to prescribe it entirely, earning mockery from colleagues who accused him of cruelty. Pain, they said, is the real disease. Heroin is the cure. Within a year, Both men had left Paris, one to the countryside, the other to a sanatorium in Switzerland. By 1923, every major hospital in the city stocked heroin as standard issue. The prescriptions multiplied, and so did the dead. Yet no one could trace the line between healing and harm. It had dissolved like the powder in a glass of water. The city trusted its doctors, and the doctors trusted their science. Both believed they were saving lives. Neither saw that they were quietly killing a century. In the apartments above Boulevard Haussmann, the nights were perfumed with roses and ether. The war had ended, and the wealthy had returned to their salons, eager to reclaim the rituals of elegance that grief had interrupted. Dinner parties glittered again, crystal glasses, silver spoons, laughter that tried too hard. Chandeliers trembled with the weight of light, and the women beneath them sparkled like they'd been carved from the same glass. Yet beneath the lace, beneath the powder and the pearls, something darker pulsed. The same cure that soothed the wounded poor had found its way into the veins of the privileged. They didn't call it addiction. In those circles, it was a habit, discreet, medical, civilized. The chemists of the Rue Royale knew their clients well. Their orders were prepared with care. Glass vials sealed with wax, labeled in Latin, delivered by carriage to gilded doorsteps. In the drawing rooms of the elite, heroin had become as essential as perfume. A faint hiss of a lighter, a flicker of silver, and the air itself seemed to grow softer. The music drifted slower, the laughter warmer, as if the entire room inhaled in unison. The aristocratic ladies swore by it. It eased the migraines that came with corsets and conversation, softened the grief that never quite left after the war. Their doctors prescribed it freely, a tonic for sleeplessness, for nerves, for the dull ache of afternoons spent being admired. They called it repose en flacon, rest in a bottle. In truth, it was a quiet surrender. They began to miss dinners, then luncheons, then days altogether. Curtains stayed drawn. Maids learned to knock softly before entering. Some rooms smelled perpetually of burnt sugar, the residue of a spoon held too long above a flame. Husbands pretended not to see. They had their own distractions. Mistresses, stock markets, the memory of battles they claimed to have won. In private, they took the same medicine to steady their hands before meetings, to numb the guilt of their fortunes made during the war. At night, they'd find their wives half dreaming in velvet armchairs, eyes half open, lips faintly parted as if listening to distant applause. They would kiss their foreheads, whisper something gentle, and pour another drink. Among the servants, whispers began. The maids called it le sommeil blanc, the white sleep. They spoke of ladies who never woke, of parties that never ended. Yet even as rumors spread, no scandal broke. Paris loved its illusions too much. Better to believe that beauty had simply grown tired than to admit that it was rotting from the inside. By 1924, addiction had become a mark of refinement. In the salons of Saint-Germain, guests bragged about the purity of their supply the way they once boasted about their wine cellars. Pain had become fashionable, and death, when it came, was discreet. Behind the velvet curtains of Parisian luxury, the city's most elegant citizens drifted deeper into silence, graceful, glowing, and gone before anyone dared to call it tragedy. In a small attic above Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, a seamstress worked by the light of a single candle. The flame quivered with every breath she took, its reflection trembling in the curved surface of her thimble. Cloth rustled beneath her fingers, silk for a gown she would never wear, silver thread gliding through the fabric like captured moonlight. The city outside was asleep, or pretending to be. Through the cracked window drifted the hum of distant jazz and the faint metallic scent of rain mixed with smoke. She had stitched dresses for women who lived in another world entirely, women who smiled from screens and balconies, their names printed in gold. But the seamstress's own name was stitched to nothing. Across the city, in a grand apartment near the Champs-Élysées, one of those women, a young actress named Mireille Darcy, stood before a mirror framed in gilt. The glass was fogged with perfume and candlelight. Her reflection looked perfect. Every curl in place, her skin like powdered porcelain. She had just returned from a premiere, the crowd's applause still echoing faintly in her ears, yet her eyes betrayed the illusion, heavy, dark, restless. On her vanity lay a small box wrapped in silk ribbon, inside it a vial of white powder finer than pearls. It was her gift from a director, her secret from the press. 2 women, one sewing beauty, one selling it, both bound by the same thread. Mireille's gowns came from the seamstress's hands, though they would never meet. Yet in the same week of that same cold spring, their fates began to cross through the invisible veins of the city's addiction. The seamstress's first dose came from a friend, a nurse at Hôpital Lariboisière, who whispered that it was for the nerves. One breath, and the ache in her shoulders faded. The hunger, too. The world became softer, the candlelight less cruel. For the first time in months, she didn't feel poor, she felt infinite. The needle became her secret luxury, her small rebellion against the life that had forgotten her name. For Mireille, the drug began as ritual. After every performance, she needed to come down from the light, to make the noise inside her skull stop echoing. Heroin offered grace where sleep could not. "It keeps me delicate," she told her makeup artist, half joking. But the truth was simpler. It made her human again. Then it made her nothing at all. By summer, the seamstress had stopped working. Her fingers trembled too much to sew. Mireille began missing rehearsals, showing up late to set with pupils like dark coins. Both women had become shadows in their own rooms, their lives stitched together by the same invisible hand. When the newspapers reported that the actress Mireille Darcy was found unresponsive in her bath, a tragic accident, they said no one noticed that. Just 2 streets away, a nameless seamstress died the same night. Her candle burned to the end. Paris kept sewing, and the stage lights kept burning. But for 2 women on opposite sides of a mirror, the white thread had finally snapped. The new season of fashion arrived like a dream, pale silks, low waists, sequins that caught the light like raindrops on glass. The mannequins stood in the windows of galleries Lafayette and Printemps, frozen in poise, their painted smiles reflected in the admiring faces of those who could never afford the gowns they wore. Paris had rediscovered beauty, or so it claimed. But beneath the shimmer of satin and the scent of violets, another kind of fabric was being woven, one threaded with secrecy and sorrow. Heroin had found its way into couture. It began discreetly, whispered among the dressmakers and stylists who worked endless hours for the fashion houses. The powder that calmed the nerves of soldiers now steadied the trembling hands of the women who stitched the hems. A small inhalation before a fitting, a drop dissolved in coffee before a long night of embroidery, it made the hours vanish, the exhaustion dissolve. "The perfect assistant," one seamstress joked. "It never complains." No one laughed. On the other end of the measuring tape, the clients too were learning the same secret. The women of the salons, aristocrats, actresses, courtesans, sought the same control over their bodies that heroin promised. The flapper silhouette demanded slenderness, sleeplessness, a kind of fragile vibrancy that only the drug could maintain. "One must be ethereal," a designer said, fastening a gown around a model's waist so tight she nearly fainted. "The future of fashion is weightless." And so they became just that, weightless, drifting from show to show, faces powdered into ghostliness, their smiles fixed as if painted on. In the backstage chaos of runway nights, the air was thick with perfume and ether. Assistants moved like clockwork, pinning, hemming, adjusting, while behind a velvet partition, a model drew a breath from a small glass tube, her pulse slowing, her shoulders dropping into divine stillness. She emerged moments later, radiant, her every movement impossibly fluid, her gaze unfocused but serene. The audience saw perfection. The photographers called it le regard lointain, the faraway look, and it became the style of the decade. No one asked what it cost to look that way. Doctors who served the elite kept their mouths shut. Fashion editors described the new beauty as delicate, introspective, translucent. The truth was simpler. It was dying in slow motion. By 1925, more than a few of the city's brightest muses were gone. Tuberculosis, the papers said, or heart failure. In truth, the syringe had replaced the corset. The pursuit of grace had turned into self-erasure. At night, the ateliers fell silent, the mannequins still standing guard over bolts of fabric and unfinished gowns. The scent of powder lingered in the air, not from makeup, but from the same white dust that now clothed Paris itself. Beauty had become a form of illness, and heroin its couturier. The city, dressed in its finest silks, was slowly stitching its own shroud. They said his studio smelled of turpentine, rain, and something else, something sweet that burned faintly in the back of the throat. The neighbors on Rue de Saint-Père had grown used to the strange hours, the scraping of brushes long after dawn, the soft thud of a stool tipping over and being set upright again. The painter's name was Etienne Marchal, and he was 28 years old when he declared that he had seen heaven not in dreams, but on the edge of a needle. Etienne had survived the war with his hands intact, but his sleep destroyed. He painted feverishly, as if afraid that rest might let the darkness catch him. At first, his work glowed with color-sunlit rivers, lovers beneath parasols, flowers so vivid they seemed to hum. Critics adored him. A resurrection of joy, one review called it. But joy was only the surface. Beneath the bright hues, a thin web of desperation clung to the paint. By 1924, his palette had begun to fade. The blues grew colder. The light lost its warmth. His dealer worried. His friends whispered. Then came the chemist. The man introduced himself at a cafe, a patron of the arts with a peculiar remedy for inspiration. He carried no canvas, only a silver cigarette case and a small vial of white powder. A muse in crystalline form, he said with a smile. It helps you see what lies behind the veil. Etienne laughed at the absurdity. But the war had already taught him that all revelation begins with pain. He tried it that night. He felt it within minutes, the trembling in his hands replaced by calm, the noise in his skull dissolving into silence. The candlelight brightened. His breath slowed until it no longer felt like breathing but floating. When he turned to his canvas, the colors bled differently. They no longer mixed, they merged. Every brushstroke became a prayer. He painted until his fingers cramped, until dawn broke and the streets below began to stir. The painting that emerged from that first night, a vision of angels dissolving into smoke, would later sell for a fortune. The critics called it transcendence. They said he had captured the divine, but the divine had come at a price. Each new painting demanded more of the powder. Each revelation a little more of his body. He told friends that heroin was not a vice but a portal. It lifts the curtain, he said. It shows me what the soul remembers. They nodded politely, pretending to understand. By the winter of 1925, the studio had become a shrine to both art and decay. Etienne's canvases filled every inch of wall space, the angels now faceless, their wings melting into shadow. He stopped signing his work. He said names no longer mattered. One morning, the concierge found the door ajar, the fire still burning low, and Etienne seated before a blank canvas. His brush rested in his lap. His eyes were open, fixed on something no one else could see. The newspapers called it tragedy. The dealers called it genius. But those who had known him understood he hadn't painted heaven. He had painted escape, and in the end, the only way to reach it was to disappear entirely into the white. It began with rain-thin, ceaseless whispering against the windowpanes of Rue Blomet, where two lovers shared a room no larger than their bed. The street itself was nothing special, a row of weather-stained facades tucked between Montparnasse and the slow river of night cafes. But to them, it was a kingdom. He was a poet with ink-stained fingers and empty pockets. She was a dancer from Lyon, newly arrived, her suitcase still smelling faintly of lavender. Together they lived on coffee, bread, and dreams, their laughter loud enough to drown the sound of hunger. Their names, Julien and Colette, became a kind of rumor among their friends. You could find them in the cafes after midnight, scribbling on napkins, dancing barefoot, arguing about God and art and the meaning of love. They were inseparable, the kind of pair people believed were born of the same fever. But like all fevered things in Paris, their story began to fade at the edges. Julien had always carried a nervous energy, a tremor that ran through his words and hands alike. When he discovered heroin, it seemed at first a blessing, a way to still the current beneath his skin. "It helps me write," he told her, smiling through half-lidded eyes. "It helps me stop thinking." Colette tried it only once, to understand the silence that followed his every dose. The warmth filled her limbs like music, soft and golden, and when she opened her eyes, the room around her seemed lit from within. She laughed, said it was nothing, said it was just for tonight. But the muse of Rue Blomet had already chosen them both. Days turned into nights without difference. The poems grew stranger, full of smoke and drowning stars. Colette stopped attending rehearsals, her dance shoes abandoned in the corner like relics of another life. Their love became ritual, the needle, the candle, the embrace that followed. They spoke less and dreamed more. Sometimes Julien would wake in the dark, convinced he had found the perfect line, only to discover his pen moving without ink. Sometimes she would stare at the ceiling for hours, her lips murmuring choreography to music no one else could hear. Neighbors complained of the smell, ether, sweat, something sweet and burnt. Friends stopped visiting. Rent went unpaid. By the summer of 1925, the room was stripped bare, except for a mattress, a mirror, and a single vase of wilted flowers. Yet they insisted they were happy. "The world," Julien whispered, "is too small for people like us." When the concierge forced the door one humid morning, the rain had stopped. The candle on the sill had burned down to glass. Colette lay half-dressed, her hand resting lightly on his chest, as if still listening for a heartbeat. In the sink, a spoon had cooled to silver. The police report called it a double misadventure. The newspapers ignored it. But in the cafes, those who remembered them would sometimes raise a glass in silence, murmur that the lovers of Rue Blomet had finally found what Paris never could, a peace too fragile for daylight. And outside their window, the rain began again. He was a careful man, the pharmacist of Rue Saint-Antoine, quiet, punctual, and precise. His shop had survived the war unscathed, its windows shining like the glass eyes of an old saint, every bottle in its place, every label written by hand. He had been proud once, proud to heal, proud to stand between suffering and relief. But by the mid-1920s, healing had turned into commerce, and relief had learned to whisper under different names. His ledger was his confessor. In it, he recorded every sale, each neat line, a life reduced to dosage. He no longer wrote heroin. Of course, that word had grown too loud. Instead, he wrote H solution or tincture blanche. The numbers stretched across the page like veins. 0.25 grams, 0.51. The names that followed read like a cross-section of Paris itself. Soldiers, school teachers, actresses, priests, countesses, a widow from Neuilly who swore the powder was the only thing that let her dream without her husband's face. To each of them he gave the same small smile, the same nod of discretion. "For the nerves," he would murmur, and the phrase covered everything. He hadn't intended to become a merchant of oblivion. It began during the shortages of 1918, when morphine was impossible to find, and desperate men knocked on his door after midnight. He had diluted, improvised, rationed, prayed, but desperation never left the city, it merely changed shape. By 1923, the demand for rest had grown too large to ignore. The suppliers from Marseille came quietly, their shipments labeled as cough syrup. Each case arrived at dawn, each invoice filed away under false names. The police never asked questions, not when their own inspectors came for their prescriptions. He tried to convince himself he was helping. The trembling hands of veterans stilled after a single dose. The widows stopped weeping. The poets paid him in sketches of angels, the painters in canvases that glowed faintly when the sun hit the dust. Yet every month, more names were crossed out. He never asked why. Death, he told himself, was the city's oldest customer. One evening, as the bells of St. Paul tolled vespers, a girl came in thin, pale, her coat too large. She asked for her mother's medicine, reading from a crumpled note, H. Solution. 2 drops before bed. Her voice was steady, practiced. He recognized the surname. He had sold the same vial to that woman every week for nearly a year. "Your mother is feeling better?" he asked gently. The girl shook her head. "She's sleeping now," she said, and placed exact change on the counter. That night, he opened his ledger and stared at the columns. So many entries, so many ghosts. He turned back to the first page and began reading the names aloud, softly, as if reciting the dead at a funeral. When he reached the end, he closed the book and locked it away. But he knew the record lived elsewhere, not in ink, but in air. The walls, the streets, the air itself. Paris had become its own pharmacy, and the receipts were written in breath. It rose above the city like pennants, the Hôpital Sainte-Anne, its pale walls catching the weak light of a Parisian dawn. From the street, it looked almost holy, its windows tall and symmetrical, its gates wrought with iron flourishes that resembled prayers. But within, the air was heavy with ammonia, morphine, and despair. The corridors echoed with a sound both mechanical and human, the squeak of gurney wheels and the distant sobs of those who could not remember how they'd come here. Sainte-Anne was not a cathedral, though its halls were filled with worshippers of a kind, the wounded, the addicted, the mad. The heroin wards had grown without acknowledgement, tucked discreetly between the departments for neurasthenia and hysteria. Officially, these patients were suffering from exhaustion, melancholia, insomnia. Unofficially, they were Paris itself, the remnants of a city that had tried to heal too quickly. Doctors moved briskly from bed to bed, their notebooks filled with numbers and euphemisms, mild dependency, chronic weakness, terminal sedation. But they all meant the same thing: another life slowly dissolving into silence. Nurses whispered that the night shift was the worst. Between midnight and dawn, the patients became restless. Some wept, some prayed, some clawed at the sheets begging for the white powder that had once made them whole. Their bodies trembled violently, as if haunted by the memory of euphoria. Others lay perfectly still, eyes open, lips moving without sound. One woman, a pianist before the war, spent her nights pressing phantom keys on the bed frame, her fingers dancing over invisible ivory. When asked what she was playing, she answered softly, "The sound of light." The doctors no longer believed in cures. Their job had become containment. Every morning they measured the dosages, adjusting them just enough to keep the patients quiet, but breathing. Some believed they were merciful, others avoided the thought entirely. One physician, Dr. Rousseau, kept a small crucifix on his desk beside a half-empty vial of heroin. He confessed to the chaplain that he sometimes used it himself to understand what they feel. The chaplain told him, understanding was not his task, only compassion. Rousseau replied, "They are the same thing here." Visitors came rarely. The families who could afford treatment sent flowers instead, white lilies, chrysanthemums, sometimes roses, their fragrance mixing with the antiseptic to create something unbearable. Those who had no families were buried quietly in the hospital cemetery behind the chapel, their names recorded on a single wooden board that the rain had begun to erase. From the roof of Sainte-Anne, one could see the whole city, its rooftops like waves of slate and smoke, its chimneys exhaling the same haze that filled the lungs of its dying. The church bells in the distance tolled for morning mass, though few inside could hear them. To the patients, every sound was underwater, every prayer a whisper trapped beneath glass. Paris called Sainte-Anne a hospital, but to those who lived and died within its walls, it was something closer to faith, a cathedral not of redemption, but of pain. where every injection was a confession and every breath a plea for a gentler kind of death. The postman still made his rounds. Every morning he climbed the narrow stairs of Sainte-Anne and the other hospitals scattered across Paris, his satchel bulging with envelopes that smelled faintly of lavender, of cologne, of faraway homes. Most of them would never be opened. Some patients had long forgotten their names. Others had no strength left to hold a pen. The nurses gathered the letters in small wooden trays beside each bed, dusted them once a week, and eventually slid them into drawers that no one would ever unlock. The city's forgotten had become its silent correspondents, their words scattered like snow, their answers lost before they began. In the heroin wards, time stretched and folded in strange ways. One patient, a young soldier named René, spent his days writing to his mother in neat, careful script. He filled dozens of pages with updates on his recovery, describing gardens that didn't exist, meals he never ate, sunlight he never saw. Each letter ended the same way: "I am better now. The doctors say I may come home soon." The nurses never told him that his mother had died 2 years before. They simply collected his letters and placed them in a small stack on his bedside table, tied with blue ribbon. When he passed away one cold morning, the letters were buried with him, unopened. Across the ward, a woman named Margot, once a singer at the Folies Bergère, kept a notebook she treated like scripture. Her handwriting looped and wavered, each line a conversation with the man she had loved. "You should have come," she wrote again and again. "The stage was too bright without you." The lights burned, and I followed them until they went out. The nurses found her notebook weeks later, the last pages blank except for a faint brown stain that had spread like shadow across the paper. In the evenings, when the corridors dimmed and the city's bells grew distant, the nurses sometimes read the letters aloud, not to the patients, but to each other. It was the only way to remind themselves that the world outside still existed. They read of childhood homes, of lovers waiting, of debts unpaid, and gardens blooming in places where no one had ever seen a poppy field that wasn't red with blood. And though they knew most of these words were written in delirium or denial, the act itself felt holy. Beyond the hospital walls, the same ritual played out across the city. In attic rooms and cheap boarding houses, addicts wrote to family they no longer dared face. Some begged forgiveness, others pretended to be traveling abroad. The letters piled up on mantels, in drawers, in forgotten corners of cafes. Few were mailed. Most were burned. The smoke from those fires rose invisibly into the Paris sky, joining the same grey veil that hung over every street. By the winter of 1926, the postman began to notice the pattern. Fewer replies, more returns, marked address inconnu. Paris was losing its voice one envelope at a time. The heroin had not just stolen the living, it had silenced the correspondence between them, replacing words with stillness. And somewhere in that silence, the city itself seemed to pause, as if waiting for an answer that would never come. The café on Rue de l'Odéon opened earlier than most. At dawn, its windows were still fogged with breath from the night before, and the tables were littered with the skeletons of dreams, cigarette butts, wine stains, scraps of paper scrawled with half-legible poems. The owner, Madame Léger, moved quietly among them, sweeping up what remained of the evening's brilliance. Every morning she found the same man asleep by the window, his coat buttoned to his chin, his head resting on folded arms. His name was Armand Lenoir, and he had once been called the voice of the generation that forgot how to pray. Before the war, Armand's words had been pure fire. His verses were printed in the little magazines that passed from hand to trembling hand in Montparnasse. He had spoken of rebirth, of youth unbroken, of love rising like sunlight through the rubble. The critics compared him to Rimbaud, though Armand always laughed at that. Rimbaud ran to Africa, he'd say. I stayed here, that's my curse. But Paris, even in peace, was no refuge. The years that followed ground him down with the soft persistence of rain. Publishers lost interest, lovers grew tired of his melancholy, and when sleep left him, Heroin arrived. It began as poetry in itself, the ritual, the rhythm, the calm descent into nothingness. He said it cleared the fog between thought and word, but soon the words began to slow. His notebooks filled with fragments. The body is only memory. The veins are rosaries. To dream is to decay gently. Each line was shorter than the one before, as though the language itself were withdrawing from him. Madame Léger tried to feed him. "You must eat, mon cher poète," she said. He would only smile and point to his coffee cup. "Words fill me better." Sometimes he paid her with verses written on napkins. One she kept folded in her apron pocket. "I loved the world, but it slept through everything I said." One morning, in the spring of 1926, Armand didn't appear at his usual table. By afternoon, the rumor had spread that he had been found in his room on Rue des Écoles, slumped over his desk, a half-empty vial beside his pen. The note he left was only 6 words long. "To dream is to drown beautifully." The paper was stained by a drop of ink that looked almost like blood. At his funeral, a handful of friends gathered, poets, painters, women with faces pale from sleeplessness. They placed flowers on his coffin, white lilies that wilted before the service ended. Someone read one of his poems aloud, his last published work. The city breathes through the mouths of the dying. A gust of wind swept the pages from the reader's hands, scattering them into the grey Paris sky. Madame Léger closed the café early that night. She left his favorite table untouched, the cup still half full, the window open to the rain. The next morning she found a new poem scratched into the wood of the table itself. 5 faint words carved by a shaking hand. "I am almost still alive. No one ever sat there again." The poet had written his last line, and Paris, for a moment, forgot how to rhyme. When the nights grew long and the morgues began to fill, Paris learned the language of wax and flame. The dead arrived quietly, now not from war, but from something gentler, something that carried the illusion of sleep. The papers called it respiratory failure, heart exhaustion, tragic illness. But in the hospitals, in the alleys, in the river that carried too many secrets, everyone knew the real name whispered in the dark. Heroin. Funeral bells tolled daily, but their sound was muffled by the fog and the traffic. It was the candles that told the truth. They appeared in windowsills and church steps, in the hands of lovers and mothers and strangers who could no longer tell whose loss they were mourning. Wax pooled on the cobblestones outside Saint-Sulpice like melted snow. The city that once glowed with art now glowed with remembrance. Each flickering flame marked another vanished face. The morgue on Ile de la Cité had begun to keep its windows open. There were too many bodies, too few names. Nurses and clerks moved among them with the indifference of exhaustion. A young attendant, barely 20, began placing small candles at the feet of the unclaimed, not as an act of faith, but of pity. "So they won't be cold," she said. By the week's end, there were dozens, each one guttering in the draught. The priests stopped her at first, then helped her light them. Paris tried to go on as if nothing had changed. The theaters reopened. The cafes played jazz. The newspapers wrote about fashion, politics, scandal, anything, but the epidemic no one could name. Yet the candles kept multiplying. One could trace their glow from Montmartre to Montparnasse, from the bridges to the brothels. Each one was a small confession, a signal to the night that someone remembered. On Rue de Rivoli, a tailor's shop displayed its finest suits beside a sign that read, "Fermé pour deuil personnel," closed for personal mourning. Inside, the tailor sat at his sewing table, a candle burning beside a spool of black thread. His son had been one of the artists lost to the Muse Blanche. He had died with paint on his fingers, his final canvas still wet. The father refused to bury the painting. "He's still working," he said. "I'll know when he's finished." At Sainte-Anne, where the hospital chapel overflowed with unclaimed souls, the nuns began lighting candles in the hundreds. Their flames blurred together, transforming grief into something almost celestial. To the addicts who could still walk, It became a pilgrimage. They came barefoot, trembling, eyes hollow, to sit among the candles and whisper prayers they no longer believed in. Some stayed until the wax ran out. Some never left. From above, the city seemed alive with scattered embers. To the pilots flying over Paris at night, it looked as if the stars had fallen and lodged themselves between the streets. But on the ground, each light was a quiet obituary, a city of candles, burning for those who had mistaken fire for warmth and found both, briefly, before the dark returned. At first, they tried to keep up appearances. The police raids were loud, theatrical, and brief boots echoing through the narrow alleys of Pigalle, lanterns slicing through the haze of smoke and sin. They seized bottles, broke glass, shouted names into the night. For a few days, it seemed as though someone cared. But by 1926, the raids had become ceremony-staged morality for the newspapers, abandoned as soon as the headlines faded. The officers stopped breaking down doors, then they stopped knocking, then they stopped coming at all. The city was too tired for justice. The prisons were full of thieves and anarchists. There was no room left for dreamers who wanted only sleep. Heroin had ceased to be a crime. It was an economy, and like all economies, it had found protection. The chemists paid quietly. The cafes passed envelopes to inspectors who looked the other way. The men in charge understood that the drug did not riot, did not protest, did not demand wages. It pacified. It made citizens obedient, soft, compliant. Why fight a sickness that kept the peace? Inspector Vallon was one of the last to believe in order. He had joined the police before the war, back when crimes still had motives and criminals still had faces. Now, everything blurred. The addicts he dragged from the streets were neither guilty nor innocent. They were simply fading. He began to notice that the same names kept reappearing on his lists, the same apothecaries, the same cafes, the same chemists, and yet nothing ever happened to them. His reports disappeared from his desk. His superiors told him to rest, to take a leave of absence. He never returned. In the quartiers once known for vice, a strange calm settled. Dealers no longer hid. They operated from behind respectable facades. A bakery on Rue Saint-Martin sold bread by day and bliss by night. A flower shop near Montparnasse carried lilies that bloomed inside the blood. The police knew. They passed by, without glancing, the glow of their cigarettes reflected in the rain. The public, too, grew numb. When a body was found in a boarding house or alley, the neighbors spoke in lowered tones, les pauvres malades, the poor sick ones. The word addict had become impolite. Patient was easier. The papers used softer phrases still. Tragic collapse, prolonged fatigue. The dead were no longer scandalous, only inevitable. By the end of the decade, heroin had woven itself into every district, like ivy, silent, stubborn, impossible to uproot. The police archives from those years tell the story in absence. Fewer raids, fewer arrests, but more bodies. Death statistics replaced criminal records. Even the morgue attendants stopped asking questions. They learned to keep their own small bottles, their own doses of sleep, to bear the smell of the living decay that arrived each dawn. And so the silence spread. The city that once punished excess now depended on it. The sirens grew rarer, the headlines faded, and Paris, ever elegant in its ruin, decided that peace, even this kind, was preferable to truth. When the police stopped knocking, it wasn't mercy that entered, it was indifference. And it stayed. There was a street, narrow and damp, that didn't appear on most maps, a forgotten vein between Rue du Temple and the Seine. Its name, once Rue des Trois Puits, had long ago faded from the corner plaque, replaced by what the locals began to call it instead, Rue de l'Abandon, the street of abandonment. It was where the city sent the people it didn't want to see anymore. The buildings leaned toward each other like conspirators, their upper floors nearly touching. Laundry hung between them, grey and stiff with soot. At night, the wind funneled through the alley and made the clothes sway like ghostly pendulums. In the flickering light of a single street lamp, One could see figures moving not quickly, not confidently, but as if underwater. They were the addicts who had no salons, no chemists, no doctors left to visit. Their veins had turned the color of the Seine, their eyes shone like wet coins in the dark. Every doorway was a shelter, every basement a refuge. Abandoned shops became makeshift dormitories, their walls painted with soot and candle flame. A group of veterans slept behind a shuttered bakery, using sacks of flour as pillows. A dancer, once radiant on the stage at the Moulin Rouge, now wandered barefoot with a shawl around her shoulders, humming the music of a life she no longer believed she had lived. A boy barely 16, too young to have seen the war but old enough to inherit its silence, earned his keep fetching supplies from the docks. He called the addicts les endormis, the sleepers, and left bread and water outside their doors before disappearing into the fog again. The authorities didn't come here. Even the police dogs refused the scent. It wasn't fear that kept them away, but futility. Rue de l'Abandon was not crime, it was surrender. The people who lived here didn't steal or fight. They simply withered, quietly and together. The neighbors learned to ignore the bodies that appeared in the mornings, curled in doorways as if still asleep. Cart drivers would collect them before sunrise, their wheels echoing through the mist like the tolling of bells. But the street had its own kind of order. The addicts shared what little they had, matches, blankets, whispers of supply. They watched over one another, not out of hope, but habit. When one of them disappeared, the others would light a candle in a cracked bottle and place it on the curb. The wind often blew it out, but they kept lighting it again. Sometimes, late at night, the sound of music would drift from one of the upper rooms, a violin, off-key and trembling, played by someone who had forgotten the melody. It was said that, on certain foggy mornings, if you stood at the entrance of the street and listened closely, you could hear the faint murmur of their dreams, a chorus of sighs, soft and endless, like waves lapping against stone. By 1927, Rue de l'Abandon no longer belonged to Paris. It had become its own small, the world, a sanctuary of forgetting. The city went on shining, dancing and painting above it, pretending the alley didn't exist. But the truth was simpler. Rue de l'Abandon was the city stripped of its glamour, left bare and breathing, where beauty and despair lay together in the dark and called it love. His shop stood at the top of Rue Lepic, just below the windmill, where the air smelled faintly of pastry and coal smoke. The sign above the door read, Pharmacie du Sacré-Cœur, its gold lettering chipped but dignified. To passers-by, it looked no different from any other Montmartre apothecary, neat glass jars, tidy shelves, the faint hum of a scale measuring powders with mechanical patience. But to those who knew, it was the heart of the city's quietest empire. The chemist's name was Adrien Lefort, a man of 60, with hair like frost and the posture of a priest. His father had been a pharmacist before him, and his father before that, men who believed that chemistry was a form of faith, a covenant between suffering and salvation. Adrien had learned early that both required precision. He had inherited the family's blue glass mortars and their wooden counter worn smooth by generations of trembling hands. He told himself that he dispensed comfort, not corruption. But by 1927, that distinction had dissolved as easily as the powder he mixed into his customers' vials. At first, his trade was quiet, almost noble. Soldiers with missing fingers, widows with sleepless eyes, artists with nerves too frayed for paint, all came seeking something stronger than patience. Adrien obliged them, writing their prescriptions with a careful flourish, adding just enough to keep them grateful, but not enough to kill them. But demand grew faster than discretion. What began as medicine became currency. Within months, he no longer dealt in prescriptions but in trust in envelopes slid across the counter. In words unspoken, he refined his own product in the cellar beneath the shop, where the stone walls sweated and the air smelled of alcohol and acetone. The recipe had come from Marseille, improved upon by his own steady hands. He called it l'ange blanc, the white angel. Its purity was legendary. Word spread through Montmartre like fire. The chemist who made angels. Painters came, then dancers, then aristocrats who sent drivers with empty valises. Each vial left his counter wrapped in velvet, sealed with red wax, stamped with his initials A.L. They treated it like perfume, unaware that the angel they worshipped had no mercy. Adrian kept records in a small black book that never left his desk. He wrote everything down: quantities, addresses, initials. He convinced himself that the precision of the numbers absolved him. "It's not sin," he whispered once to his apprentice, "if you measure it perfectly." But as the months passed, the handwriting changed, looser, shakier. He had begun sampling his own work. The pharmacist had become his own patient. One night, a storm rolled in from the west, shaking the shutters and flooding the alleyways below. Adrian stayed in the cellar, watching the candlelight flicker against the glass vials lined like soldiers awaiting command. The rain drummed overhead, the city blurred into sound. He thought of his father's hands, steady and proud, grinding roots into medicine. He thought of the hundreds who now dreamed because of him, or because of his poison. By dawn, the cellar was silent. The candle had burned to nothing. When the apprentice arrived, he found the chemist slumped over the counter, his black ledger open to a final entry written in an unsteady hand: "The angel took me back." The police sealed the shop the next morning, yet for weeks afterward, the addicts of Montmartre still climbed Rue Lepic at dusk, leaving coins and wilted lilies at the door. They whispered his name like prayer, not in accusation, but in gratitude. For in the city of endless hunger, Adrienne Lefort had given them wings, and they could not tell whether they had flown or merely fallen. She lived on the 5th floor of a narrow building off Boulevard de Clichy, where the light from the Moulin Rouge flickered against her curtains like distant applause. Her real name was Thérèse Alain, though Paris had long since forgotten it. On the posters that lined the kiosks and the theatre walls, she was Lydia Duval, a name that glittered like champagne, one invented by her manager to sound foreign and expensive. Her face, framed by pearls and smoke, had once graced every billboard from Montmartre to Marseille. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, had sold the illusion of joy to a city that no longer knew what it was. But behind the shimmer, Lydia, or Thérèse, as she sometimes still remembered in half-sleep, was beginning to disappear. The stage had been her temple. For years, she moved through its light, like a saint through incense, her voice soft and shimmering as silk. But after the war, the audiences changed. They wanted distraction, not devotion, laughter louder, skirts shorter, the illusion brighter. Directors demanded perfection, and Thérèse learned to give it, no matter the cost. To still her trembling hands before curtain call, she began taking the powder for the nerves a doctor had prescribed. It worked too well. The anxiety melted, the fatigue dissolved, and the light that once terrified her now seemed tender, forgiving. She began to believe that the white dust was her truest mirror, that without it, she would vanish entirely. Her performances grew more ethereal. Critics wrote that Lydia Duval possessed a sadness that glows. Men filled the front rows to see that glow, mistaking the stillness of her gaze for mystery. They did not know it came from within, from a body so still it had forgotten how to hunger, from a heart that had slowed to a rhythm softer than applause. Between acts, she no longer spoke to anyone. She would sit before the mirror, her reflection multiplying in the rows of bright bulbs, her powder, compact, open beside her vial. The two became indistinguishable. One evening, during a rehearsal, she forgot her first line. Then the next. The stagehand called her name twice before she turned, blinking as though pulled from underwater. "I don't remember who I am," she whispered, and everyone laughed, thinking it a joke. But when she failed to appear at the evening's performance, they found her sitting in her dressing room, still in costume, her lips moving soundlessly, her eyes fixed on the mirror. On her vanity she had written in lipstick, "She took everything, even my name." They admitted her to St. Anne under the diagnosis of severe fatigue. For weeks she drifted between lucidity and oblivion, humming songs from her shows to no one in particular. Sometimes, when the nurses called her Thérèse, she smiled faintly, as if the name was a melody she once knew. Then, one morning, she did not wake. The newspaper obituary was brief. Stage star Lydia Duval passes. Unexpectedly at 28, Paris mourns its brightest flame. That night, the theaters dimmed their lights for a single minute. Outside, a light drizzle fell, smudging her face from the posters until only the eyes remained wide, hollow, waiting for a name to return. Before Heroin wore its silken Parisian mask, its older brother had already seduced the world. Opium, smoky, slow and scented with empire, had drifted through Europe long before the Great War, carried from the ports of Shanghai and Saigon in carved wooden chests that smelled faintly of spice and salt. But by the 1920s, its reign was waning. The pipes had gone cold, the dens shuttered. Heroin was faster, cleaner, more modern, the child of chemistry rather than the earth. Yet the two were bound by blood, and their shared empire stretched far beyond the Seine. In the port of Marseille, ships arrived daily from Indochina, their hulls heavy with cargo that never appeared on the manifests. Inside burlap sacks labeled Thay or Épicés hid the black bricks of raw opium, wrapped in wax paper stamped with Chinese characters. Dockworkers whispered of La Main Noire, the Black Hand, a loose network of traders, sailors, and chemists who turned the world's pain into profit. The morphine refineries along the coast converted the tar into crystalline powder, fine as frost. From there, it traveled north in the false bottoms of wine barrels, in crates of olives, in the lining of women's coats. By the time it reached Paris, it was immaculate, white as chalk, silent as breath. The city's new aristocracy of dealers emerged from unexpected places. A Corsican ship captain, a retired chemist from Lyon, a widow who ran a perfumery on Rue du Bac, her bottles labeled Essence de Pavotte, poppy essence. They met in backrooms and parlors, drinking cognac and dividing the continent like cartographers of despair. No one used the word drug. They spoke instead of medicine, of supply chains, of distribution. Commerce, after all, was cleaner than sin. Opium had once inspired poets, Coleridge, Baudelaire, Wilde. Heroin inspired accountants. Its trade was efficient, invisible, and global. The factories that produced morphine for hospitals now funneled their excess through back doors. Government inspectors took bribes in cash, or sometimes in kind. The same state that condemned the addict quietly profited from his dependence. The same ships that brought silken tea now carried the ghost of an empire harvested in Asia, refined in France, consumed in every glittering salon and back alley of Europe. One French journalist tried to expose it. His name was Henri Villard, and his article, Les Veines de l'Empire, appeared in Le Matin in the summer of 1926. It traced the route from Saigon's poppy fields to the veins of Paris's elite. The morning after publication, his editor received a polite letter from the Ministry of Health, assuring readers that the nation's medical resources remain under strict control. Henri's byline never appeared again. By autumn, the city's pharmacies carried discreet bottles marked Importé de Marseille. The heroin inside still smelled faintly of the sea. Its lineage was ancient, the same dream that had drifted through pipes in Shanghai, now crystallized for the veins of Montparnasse. Paris liked to think it was different, cleaner, civilized, but every dose was a map, every breath a confession of empire. And the poppies that once bloomed in Asia were now blooming again, invisibly, quietly, in the hearts of those who thought themselves free. They were not saints, nor sinners, nor symbols. They were just hands, ordinary, human, trembling. Hands that once wrote letters, painted walls, buttoned children's coats. Hands that once worked the looms, stirred the soup, sketched the future. Now they served a smaller purpose, to balance a spoon above a candle's flame, to steady the shaking long enough for the world to fade. In Paris, by 1927, that gesture had become as common as striking a match. The city's new prayer began with heat and ended in silence. Each hand told its own story, In a cramped garret on Rue Mouffetard, an old seamstress, the last of her trade, heated her medicine in a coffee spoon blackened from use. She had pricked her fingers for decades, sewing gowns for women who would never know her name. Now her fingers trembled too much to thread a needle. The heroin was cheaper than bread and kinder than hunger. She used her thimble to measure it, 1 for sleep, 2 for forgetfulness. On the left bank, a painter used the same ritual before he began each canvas. His palms were blistered from turpentine, his wrists scarred where the veins had begun to collapse. He said the powder made his colors breathe. Sometimes he forgot to paint entirely, staring at his hands for hours as if they no longer belonged to him. His landlady found him one morning, the spoon still balanced perfectly on the windowsill, the candle melted into lace. A soldier from Verdun, his body a ruin of scars and metal, sat each evening at the kitchen table with his wife. They never spoke. He prepared the mixture for her as carefully as if he were making tea. She had been a nurse during the war. The gas had ruined her lungs, and the heroin dulled the coughing. When he lit the candle, she reached for his hand, and for a moment they were back in the hospital tents, surrounded by fire and prayer. He always used his left hand to draw the liquid, because the right one still trembled from the trenches. In Montmartre, the ritual became social small gatherings, where artists, models, and musicians shared their supplies in a circle of light and laughter. They passed the spoons like communion, each participant murmuring their gratitude before closing their eyes. The spoons clinked softly, a strange symphony of salvation. "It's beautiful," one sculptor said, "to watch people disappear so gracefully." The police never saw these hands. They saw statistics, evidence, residue. But to the city itself, these hands were everywhere in every arrondissement, from the gilded salons to the gutters. Paris had become a workshop of dissolution, and the tools were simple: flame, spoon, syringe, breath. Sometimes, in the early morning light, when the fog drifted through open windows, you could see the spoons glinting on the tables of empty rooms, tiny mirrors reflecting the pale dawn. The hands were gone, but their shape remained in the cooled wax, in the stains on wood, in the faint smell of sugar burned too long. They were the fingerprints of a city quietly teaching itself how to vanish, one careful dose at a time. He was not a cruel man, only tired. Lieutenant Marcel Aubry of the Paris Police Prefecture had worn his uniform for 20 years, long enough to know the rhythm of decay. The war had carved deep lines into his face and something colder behind his eyes. He had seen riots, murders, the starving children of Belleville, and the glittering lies of the rich. But none of it prepared him for the quiet deaths, the ones that made no sound, no struggle, only a sigh and the smell of burnt sugar left behind. When the heroin epidemic first reached his desk, the orders were clear: contain, suppress, report. But what did one arrest? A woman with glassy eyes in a silk gown? A boy shaking on the steps of Saint-Michel? A veteran who had traded his medals for morphine? Each criminal looked like a patient, each addict another symptom of a city unraveling. He filled out his forms with careful penmanship, signing his name beneath lies he no longer believed. Cause of death: accidental poisoning. Circumstance: private residence. He stopped writing heroin after his superior told him to. "It reflects poorly on morale," the man had said, his breath thick with brandy. Marcel's patrols changed. The old vices, the gamblers, the thieves, the whores, had been replaced by ghosts. They did not run when he approached. They barely looked up. They sat in doorways and under bridges, their arms a constellation of bruises, their skin pale as candle wax. Some smiled when they saw him, as if mistaking him for a priest. "It's all right, Lieutenant," one woman said once. "You can leave me. I'm already leaving myself." He did. He always did. The corruption spread upward, as it always did. Inspectors were bribed to look away. Doctors sold prescriptions like tickets. The ministry sent new memos printed on expensive paper, about progressive rehabilitation, which meant more hospitals without medicine, more bureaucrats pretending to care. The police became custodians of silence. Their duty was no longer to protect, but to forget. One evening, Marcel was called to a mansion on Avenue Foch, a young aristocrat found dead in her bed, pearls tangled in her hair. The family insisted on discretion. "A tragic illness," her father whispered. Marcel stood in the doorway, the evidence bag heavy in his hand. A vial labeled A.L., the initials of the late chemist Lefort. He could see the girl's portrait above the mantel, laughing, alive. The candlelight flickered across her painted eyes, and for a moment he imagined she was watching him. When he turned to his partner, he simply said, "No report." The man nodded. After that night, Marcel stopped patrolling. He requested office duty, sorting paperwork no one would ever read. His pen scratched across the pages, recording deaths that no longer shocked him. On his desk, he kept one small envelope sealed in wax inside it, a single silver spoon taken from that mansion, blackened at the bowl. Some nights, he turned it over in his hands like a relic, remembering the girl, the chemist, the street, the city, all of it connected by one endless silence. By 1928, Paris had stopped asking why people were dying. It only asked how quietly they could go. And so did Marcel. He filed his final report, locked his drawer, and walked out into the fog. No one ever saw him again. But the next morning, a patrolman found his hat neatly placed on the Pont Neuf rail, beside a single spoon that glinted faintly in the dawn. The bells of Notre Dame rang on a Sunday that smelled of rain and coal smoke, their echoes slipping through the narrow streets like a reminder that faith still existed somewhere above the fog. Inside the cathedral, the pews were half full, the congregation a mixture of the devoted and the desperate. The Bishop of Paris, Henri Delacroix, stood before them, his voice carrying through the nave in solemn rhythm. He was a tall man, dignified, his hair silvering like the candlelight that trembled across the marble. He spoke of salvation, of duty, of temptation. But that morning, his sermon took a different tone, one that even the saints in the stained glass might have found uneasy. "The city," he said, "is drowning not in sin of the flesh, but in the sin of forgetting." His words rolled through the cold air, measured and careful. "We have replaced prayer with powders, mercy with medicine. The soul cannot be cured by chemistry." The congregation shifted. Some bowed their heads. Others stared, unblinking. A few women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, though no one was sure whether from guilt or boredom. He had seen it himself. The confessions had changed. Where once there had been lovers' quarrels, lies, envy, and pride, now there was only one refrain: "Father, I am tired. I only wanted to rest." The heroin epidemic had breached even the sanctity of the church's walls. Choir boys nodded off during Vespers. A nun in Saint-Denis was found unconscious in her cell, a bottle labeled Remède pour le sommeil at her side. The bishop's own sacristan, a gentleman named Paul, had been dismissed after a relapse that ended with him whispering psalms through trembling lips, unable to hold the chalice steady. Bishop Delacroix fought to believe that this was still sin, that it could be confessed and absolved. Yet he found himself wondering whether what he saw was closer to despair, or worse, apathy. The addicts he encountered in the streets did not to look defiant. They looked devout, their faces calm, their eyes turned inward as if awaiting judgment from within. "They kneel without altar," he told the priests at dinner one evening, "and the thing they worship answers faster than God." In his private chambers, the bishop kept a letter from the Ministry of Health, warning him not to speak against the pharmaceutical enterprises essential to the economy. It was signed by a man whose son he had buried the previous year. He folded it carefully each time he read it, as if by precision he might fold the hypocrisy away. The following Sunday, he preached again, though fewer attended. He spoke of redemption, not of the soul, but of memory. "Remember," he said, "the body is not a laboratory. The heart is not a wound to be numbed." His voice broke only once, when he added softly, "We have mistaken numbness for peace, and Paris, my children, is dying peacefully." When the mass ended, a young woman approached him. Her hands shook as she kissed his ring. "Father," she whispered, "what if sin feels like mercy?" He wanted to tell her the truth, that he no longer knew the difference. But instead, he blessed her, because that was all the church could offer now. The illusion of grace in a city that had already chosen anesthesia. That night, as the rain began to fall again over Notre Dame, Bishop Delacroix walked the aisles alone. The candles burned low, their flames faint and uncertain, like souls too weak to rise. He whispered one last prayer into the silence, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to keep believing that there was still something left to save. The first frost came early that year. It clung to the cafe windows like breath, turning the reflections of passers-by into ghosts. The boulevards were slick with sleet, the street lamps veiled in halos of pale gold. Montparnasse, once the roaring heart of the city's brilliance, had gone quiet. The jazz still played, but softer now, like a record left spinning after the dancers had gone. The laughter that once spilled from La Coupole and Le Dôme had thinned to murmurs. The artists who had survived the decade's fever now drifted through the cold, like remnants of a dream, their faces drawn, their eyes rimmed in grey. Inside the cafes, the stoves glowed red, and the regulars huddled close, coats still on, fingers wrapped around glasses of absinthe gone tepid. They spoke in half-sentences of debts, of deadlines, of someone who hadn't been seen in weeks. Every conversation carried the weight of absence. They had begun to measure time not by calendars, but by funerals. "Do you remember Etienne?" one painter asked. "The one who saw angels?" The others nodded. "He's gone too." The words fell like snow, soft, inevitable, soundless. On the streets, the winter revealed what the summer had hidden. In the narrow alley behind Rue Varvin, a man sat hunched against a wall, his breath clouding in the air. A small bottle rolled from his lap and shattered on the stones. No one stopped to look. Across the river, near the Gare d'Orsay, a group of addicts had made a shelter from tarpaulin and broken furniture, lighting fires in tin buckets to keep their blood from freezing. They passed a single syringe among them like a communion chalice, their shadows flickering against the frost-covered bricks. The city itself seemed to tremble. The Seine moved sluggishly, its surface glazed with ice. Police patrols became rarer, their lanterns dim in the mist. The charity hospitals were full. The morgues overflowed. Even the churches grew colder, the candles too. Few, the prayers too faint. Those who still believed spoke of judgment. The rest spoke of endurance. Among the cafes that still opened each evening was one on the corner of Boulevard Raspail, a refuge for writers, poets, and painters who could not afford heat. The owner, an old woman named Cécile, lit candles at every table and served thin soup for those who had nothing left to pay. She said she did it out of pity, though no one believed her. "It's for company," she would say, smiling softly. "The living are easier to keep warm than memories." One night, a blizzard swept across the city, blotting out the moon. The rooftops disappeared into white. By morning, Montparnasse looked purified, silent, clean, untouched. But beneath the snow, the same despair slept on, patient as ever. The wind carried no laughter, only the faint rattle of glass from the shuttered windows. When the thaw came weeks later, the bodies appeared again in stairwells, in alleys, in rooms that smelled of ether and melted wax. The city did not weep, it simply adjusted, as it always did. Spring would return, and with it, the illusion of recovery. But for that one winter, Montparnasse had no art, no fever, no song, only silence and snow, each flake a whisper for the dead. He rented a narrow room above a bookstore on Rue Monsieur le Prince, the kind of place where the wallpaper peeled and the ceiling groaned whenever it rained. His name was Jules Mercier, though his few surviving friends called him Le Chroniqueur des Morts, Lentz the chronicler of slow deaths. He had once been a journalist, the sort who believed that words could still shame the powerful and rouse the indifferent. By 1928, he had grown gaunt, his clothes perpetually smelling of ink and damp tobacco. But the conviction that had kept him alive through the war refused to die. Paris, he wrote, was not sick by accident. It was being poisoned deliberately, profitably, beautifully. Every morning, he descended to the café below his room, ordered the cheapest coffee, and filled the margins of old newspapers with notes. He collected obituaries, not the ones for politicians or poets, but the brief, forgettable lines that read, "Died suddenly, illness unnamed." He clipped them, catalogued them, and began tracing the pattern that everyone else pretended not to see. The names changed, the addresses varied, but the cause was always the same: a quiet dose, a white breath, a final sleep mistaken for peace. He visited hospitals disguised as a clerk, copying death certificates into a notebook bound in brown leather. He bribed morgue attendants to let him see the unclaimed bodies, thin, pale, identical. He interviewed widows who whispered that their husbands had been sold medicine that promised to heal the soul. From his narrow desk, he began assembling what he called Le Livre des Blancs, the Book of Whites, a dossier of every lost life he could trace to the chemists, the doctors, the merchants of oblivion. The more he wrote, the more the city resisted. Editors refused his articles. One warned him bluntly, "People do not want to read about ghosts, Jules. They have enough of their own." Another returned his manuscript without opening it, leaving only a note that read, "Do not mistake truth for safety." His letters to the Ministry of Health went unanswered. One evening, as he left his building, he noticed a man standing across the street, smoking a cigarette that never seemed to burn down. The man followed him for weeks, always at a distance, always silent. Still, Jules kept writing. "Every addict has two deaths," he wrote. "The first when the blood goes quiet, the second when the world forgets." He vowed that Paris would not forget. He spent his last savings printing a few hundred pamphlets of his investigation, folded neatly and left in cafes, on church steps, in the pockets of coats hanging in cloakrooms. Within days, police seized them. The cafe owner downstairs was fined. The printer vanished. A month later, Jules was found in his room, slumped over his desk, his typewriter still holding the final page of his book. The words read simply, "It was never a plague, it was a market." The papers called it suicide. Those who had known him knew better. At the funeral, only 3 people attended: one priest, one printer's apprentice, and the cafe owner. The priest said no eulogy. The apprentice lit a single candle on the grave and whispered, "You tried." The city went on sleeping. The chemists went on selling. And in a drawer of the prefecture, somewhere deep beneath the dust of decades, lay an unmarked file labeled Mercier, Jules Cause Indéterminé. The ink had already begun to fade. The doors never locked. Not really. La Fleur de Montparnasse, perched on the corner of Boulevard du Montparnasse and Rue de l'Ombre, had been open for decades, but by the mid-1920s, it had become something more than a café. A sanctuary for the restless, the haunted, and the addicted. The gas lamps flickered continuously, as though the proprietors feared that even a moment of darkness would invite the city's ghosts inside. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, damp wool, and the faint, sweet tang of ether that clung to the edges of the tables. Regulars arrived at all hours, painters with eyes still reddened from the night before, poets who had forgotten the words they had meant to write, dancers whose joints ached and fingers trembled, soldiers who had returned from the war, their medals still pinned to their jackets, slumped into chairs with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleep. The café's owner, Madame Violette, had long since stopped counting hours. She poured coffee and absinthe alike, filling cups with patience rather than judgment, listening to the low murmur of conversation that never truly ended. At midnight, the musicians would begin to play. A piano, slightly out of tune, set the rhythm. A violin, pulled from some long-forgotten trunk, wept beneath the gaslight. The notes floated through the haze, wrapping themselves around the patrons like a soft warning. The music never ended. It did not pause for sleep or hunger or despair. It only continued, a heartbeat for a city that had forgotten how to beat on its own. In the back, under a low archway, a small circle formed nightly. Artists and writers, dealers and dancers, clustered around a single candle. On the table rested a silver spoon, blackened from repeated use, and a vial of powder that glimmered faintly under the lamplight. Each participant inhaled, and each exhalation seemed to settle the smoke in the cafe itself, thickening the air into a tangible presence. Conversations became whispers. Laughter softened. No one left until the candle burned low, and even then, the patrons staggered into the streets as if floating on the remnants of dream. The walls were adorned with sketches, clippings, and postcards, remnants of lives that had come through the cafe and never fully returned. A poet had drawn angels with eyes that bled. A painter had scribbled silhouettes of lovers dissolving into smoke. No one cared if the works were finished. The act of creation mattered more than completion. Madame Violette swept the floor each morning, collecting the discarded sketches, storing them in boxes that smelled faintly of powder and rain. By dawn, the patrons had vanished. The streets were quiet, the fog creeping in from the Seine. A stray cat prowled along the curb. The cafe, however, remained awake. Its gas lamps flickered in anticipation of nightfall, ready to receive the next wave of those seeking comfort, oblivion, or inspiration. La Fleur de Montparnasse had become more than a cafe. It was a threshold, a small liminal space where Paris paused, exhaled, and offered itself fragile, trembling, and endlessly patient to the white muse. Even as the city slept, the cafe waited, and every evening, when the first figure crossed the threshold, the lights would burn a little brighter, as if knowing that for one more night, the world could forget, if only briefly, the silence outside. The morgue of Saint-Lazare had a different kind of stillness than the hospitals. It was colder, harder, more absolute. The walls were white and damp, the stone floors slick with the residue of winter rain that tracked in from the street. Here, the dead arrived quietly, as if Paris itself had decided to send them directly from the fogged streets into glass-lined drawers. No relatives, no grief-stricken visitors, only the occasional clerk or nurse, moving mechanically, their breath visible in the chill, their gloves too thin for the task. By 1928, the majority of arrivals were young, pale, and unfamiliar to the city's memory. The causes were listed in neat script: unknown, respiratory failure, accidental poisoning. But the nurses who worked the night shifts understood the truth. They whispered to each other when the doctors were gone, naming the victims softly: Elise, Mark, Lydia. Names borrowed from newspapers, from cafe gossip, from the chalked entries in Lefort's ledger. They lit small candles by the drawers, not for superstition, but as a ritual, a way to honor lives that had been erased before anyone could notice. Some nights, the whispers became audible, carried through the narrow corridors like ghosts pressing against the walls. The patients of the wards above those who had survived, who shuffled back into their apartments, who still had one foot in the living, sometimes spoke of voices they could hear through the floors. They swore it was the dead reminding them of the debts owed, of promises broken. Others said it was the wind, or the settling of the building. But even the most skeptical nurses paused when the sounds were softest. A word, almost a sigh, carried over the polished stone. One particularly bitter night, a clerk named Henri found a note tucked between two drawers, written in pencil on a torn page from a ledger: "Do not forget us." He knew no one had left it. The morgue was locked, checked, patrolled. He read it aloud to no one. It trembled in his hand, as if infused with the voices of every life that had entered these walls. For days afterward, Henry swore he heard quiet laughter, too soft to be natural, echoing between the slabs. Families rarely came. Letters arrived addressed to those who were no longer there. They piled in the office, unopened, yellowed, unsent. One widow from Montparnasse sent parcels of food each week to her son, only to learn months later that he had been found in a drawer, folded like a page in a book. The irony was cruel. She had nourished the living for the comfort of the dead. Paris never intervened. The city had learned to look away. The morgue itself became a repository not just of bodies, but of memory. Each drawer a ledger of the city's sins, each candle a witness to the quiet tragedy that flowed alongside the Seine. The nurses moved like shadows between the tables, their gloved hands brushing over nameplates as if to soothe the living into the dead. By dawn, the sun was nothing more than pale light on stone, and the voices, if they had been there, were gone. Only the faint smell of ether and decay lingered. The morgue whispered, however, in ways that no law, no medicine, and no priest could silence. In the stillness of the room, Paris's unseen children, the ones it had abandoned to the powder, to the fog, to the white muse, spoke softly of a city that had forgotten them, yet somehow, in that quiet, remembered. She arrived at the theatre each night like a comet, her movements precise and luminous. Marguerite Delorme was her name, though Parisian newspapers often shortened it to Margot, as if familiarity could make the brilliance easier to grasp. Her pale skin glimmered under the stage lights, her arms stretched like wings, her feet barely touching the polished boards. Critics called her ethereal, divine, the embodiment of the music that floated above the audience. But behind the spotlight, behind the applause, Marguerite was unraveling. It began with fatigue, a subtle trembling in the ankles that she dismissed as overwork. Rehearsals ran late into the night, hours stretching like taffy across the dim corridors of the theatre. Her parents were gone, her friends too busy chasing their own dreams. Marguerite sought solace in the same powder that had already claimed painters, poets, and actresses of the previous decade. The first dose was almost ceremonial, a whisper of relief, a breath of clarity that erased the ache from her limbs. The next was slightly stronger, then another, until the line between medicine and obsession blurred. Backstage, the ritual was quiet. A small spoon, a flame from a candle, the powder dissolved into liquid and inhaled. Each night, Marguerite emerged onto the stage with a smile that hid trembling fingers, with eyes that glimmered yet flickered, as if aware of the danger beneath the skin. Critics, enchanted by her grace, wrote of transcendence. No one noticed the faint bruises where she pinched her arms, the hollow shadows beneath her eyes, the faint trembling that had begun to haunt every leap. The theatre itself seemed complicit. The stagehands, accustomed to the spectacle of exhaustion, moved without comment. The managers, hungry for box office, ignored the warning signs. Marguerite's fellow dancers whispered of sleepless nights, of friends who never returned home, of vials hidden behind velvet curtains. But the show went on, and Paris refused to see. On a cold February evening, she performed La Sylphide. The music began, delicate and cruel, and Marguerite lifted herself onto the stage with her usual poise. The audience held its breath as she glided across the boards, the powder's effect lending her every movement, the impossible suspension of weightlessness. Midway through the final pirouette, her ankle gave way, her body collapsed onto the stage. The orchestra stopped abruptly, the last notes of the flute dying in the air. The lights dimmed in horror as stagehands rushed forward, but she did not move. She was taken backstage, her body pale as snow. The doctors pronounced her dead before she could even be carried out to the street. The newspapers, ever eager for brevity, printed her obituary in a single column. Promising young ballerina passes unexpectedly. Paris mourns. No mention of the powder, no mention of the nights spent behind curtains in candlelight. In her dressing room, the vials remained on the vanity, one tipped over. A small puddle of white powder crystallized on the polished wood. The mirror reflected her absence, the costume hanging like a shroud. In the months that followed, dancers whispered her name, but only as a cautionary tale. The girl who danced too high, who reached too far, who had trusted the white muse more than the stage itself. Paris applauded, as it always did, and moved on, leaving Marguerite's body, and the dream she carried behind in silence. He arrived in Paris like a shadow drifting across the river. His name was Jean Morel, though few in the city ever called him that. To most, he was simply Le Provençal, the man from Marseille. His hair was black, slicked back with oil, his eyes dark, calculating, and endlessly watchful. He carried nothing but a small leather satchel, a briefcase of paper labels, and a quiet determination. The war had ended, and Europe had grown hungry for distraction, for comfort, for oblivion. Jean was here to provide it. From the docks of Marseille, he brought with him shipments no customs officer would question. Crates marked as tea, barrels of wine, sacks of coffee, each concealing the city's newest luxury. White powder, refined from raw opium, distilled and purified into a crystalline form that Paris had not yet seen in such abundance. Where morphine had been common, this was stronger, cleaner, faster. A single gram could carry a body through a week of pain and an evening of artistry. It was opium's cousin, perfected, modern, and dangerously seductive. He moved quietly at first, delivering parcels to chemists who had already established networks, their names discreetly written in Lefort's ledger. Pharmacies on Rue Saint-Honoré, Rue de Rivoli, and Montmartre accepted the cargo without hesitation. The White Muse had already spread her wings. Jean merely ensured that Paris's appetite would be fed without interruption. He made his rounds with precision, leaving nothing to chance. Vials placed behind velvet curtains, payments accepted in cash or in kind, no questions asked. The city did not notice him. Paris was preoccupied with its lights, its cafes, its artists chasing beauty and oblivion alike. Painters and poets were already trading glimpses of heaven for the smallest white vial. Aristocrats, dancers, and actresses pressed silk gloves to their faces to hide tremors they refused to acknowledge. The invisible arms of addiction had reached into every arrondissement. Jean's presence was only a whisper, a shadow among shadows. But the delivery network was fragile. Rival chemists from Lyon, smugglers from Bordeaux, and opportunistic dockworkers constantly threatened exposure. Jean navigated it with a careful balance of charm and menace. He carried a ledger of his own, recording shipments and destinations with meticulous handwriting. Each name represented both a client and a potential threat. One misstep could bring the police, the press, or a rival gang crashing down upon him. Yet he moved forward with unwavering certainty, his mind calculating risk like a chessboard, every pawn and rook a potential downfall. By autumn, the city was awash in his product. Montparnasse cafes had emptied of their sober patrons. Theaters echoed with applause from performers whose limbs were steadied by the powder. Hospitals reported more fainting spells than before. Jean watched from his rented apartment near the Seine as the city embraced him. Silently, unknowingly, Paris had become a mirror of itself, brilliant, decadent, addicted, and quiet. And as he settled into the rhythm of deliveries and meetings with his silent network, he knew that the next shipment would be larger, cleaner, and even more irresistible. The city had welcomed him, and he intended to stay a ghost from Marseille, ensuring that the White Muse's empire stretched uninterrupted across the streets, the cafes, and the veins of Paris. The river had always carried secrets, but by the winter of 1928, it began to carry something heavier. Heroin, discarded by authorities and unclaimed by the city, found its way into the Seine. Crates seized from smugglers were emptied, vials broken, powders dissolved into the frigid water. They said it was for public safety, a method of cleansing. The bureaucrats called it destruction by disposal. But the river, dark and endless, did not forgive. The liquid, white and almost luminous beneath the moon, spread like a ghost over the surface, twisting into eddies and whirlpools, leaving a faintly sweet chemical scent along the quays. The docks were empty that night, the men who usually hauled crates home sick with suspicion and fear. Only the river moved with purpose, carrying the weight of the city's secrets downstream. In some places, small fish floated belly up, their bodies slick with the residue of the powder. Seagulls, hesitant at first, began to pick at them. The Seine had swallowed more than water that night. It swallowed innocence, ambition, and despair. By dawn, the first pedestrians noticed something strange. Their boots left footprints in a slick that smelled faintly of almonds, sweet and chemical. The water along the quays shimmered unnaturally, reflecting the pale winter sun. Children paused in the streets to watch the surface bubble and twist. Boatmen whispered about a strange calm, the river unusually still, almost sentient. And from the city above, Paris looked down at the Seine as if it had become a mirror reflecting everything the city refused to admit. In Montmartre, a painter stepped out onto his balcony and inhaled the scent, thinking first it was rain, then remembering the powder he had seen in the cafes, in the basements, in the hands of friends. He shivered. The river's reflection seemed to shimmer like his last canvas, the one he had never dared to finish. Somewhere in the distance, a violin trembled in the fog, and he realized it was not music but memory floating across the water. The authorities reported nothing. The newspapers published only the usual fog, cold, industrial runoff. But those who walked along the Pont Neuf and the Quai de la Tournelle could see it clearly. White swirls rose briefly, dissolving into the dark current, like spirits struggling against the pull. Dockworkers spoke of the river of ghosts, warning each other not to fish, not to drink, not to touch. The Seine had become a repository, a cemetery, a silent witness to the city's quiet addiction. By nightfall, the smell had reached the cafes and theaters. Patrons paused mid-laugh, mid-step, mid-breath. The White Muse had entered the river, and through it she touched everything: boats, bridges, quays, homes. Paris exhaled, unconsciously holding itself in awe, fear, and complicity. The water had taken what the city could no longer control: vials, spoons, lives, and finally, conscience. And, beneath the reflection of gaslights on the Seine, the powder continued to swirl, invisible to the city above, patient as ever. It was not a warning, nor a miracle, nor a threat. It was the river remembering the lives that had been surrendered to it, carrying them silently toward an unknown horizon where even the White Muse could not follow. She arrived at the studio the day after the auction, her skirts heavy with grief and the frost of winter. Her name was Isabelle Marchal, widow of Etienne, the painter who had once claimed to see heaven in the haze of a needle. The room smelled faintly of turpentine and candle smoke, the canvases leaning against the walls like silent witnesses. Etienne had left hundreds of paintings, some finished, some only suggestions of light and shadow, angels dissolving into mist. Isabelle had promised herself she would not let them fall into the hands of collectors who would see only money, never the lives etched into the strokes. The studio was quiet, except for the faint drip of water from a leaky pipe in the corner. She walked carefully, her fingers tracing the outlines of canvases, as if speaking to her husband through touch. Each painting was a memory of him, not the man who walked the streets of Montparnasse, not the one who had smiled at the cafes, but the one who had vanished into powder and flame, leaving only color behind. She thought of the first vial he had taken, the first inhalation that had turned brushstrokes into prayer, and now she was the steward of his absence, tasked with preserving both the beauty and the ruin he left behind. Collectors came by that morning, as expected, their shoes clicking across the worn wooden floors. They praised the composition, the use of light, the haunting genius. Isabelle listened politely, offering tea and cookies, but she refused to sell a single painting. "They are not yours," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than any argument. "They belong to him, to the moments he saw and the people he touched. You will not own that." In the back of the studio, she discovered Etienne's final canvas, still damp in the morning frost filtering through the window. It was an angel, faceless, wings evaporating into smoke, suspended in a field of stars. Isabelle knelt before it, brushing away a layer of dust. She could almost hear him, the soft inhalation before creation, the trembling of hands steady with devotion, the exhale into eternity. She pressed her cheek to the canvas, breathing the faint scent of linseed and powder. It was the closest she would come to holding him again. Throughout the day, she moved from painting to painting, cataloguing, cleaning, and rearranging. She found notes in the margins of sketchbooks. Do not forget the color of their eyes. Light bends here. This is the way they float. Each note was a testament, a guide for someone who would never need it. She understood that the studio had become a mausoleum, not for Etienne's body, but for the lives his work had touched, for the people who had drifted into oblivion with him. By nightfall, Isabelle had made her decision. She would burn nothing, for fire would erase too much. But she would not sell, not even a single piece. The paintings would remain in the studio, a silent memorial to the artist and the city that had consumed him. Montparnasse would keep its secret, and through the widow's vigilance, Etienne's vision would remain untainted by commerce, unclaimed by the indifferent, and untouched by the hands that saw only profit. As she locked the door that evening, the candles flickered low, and a single draught carried the faintest trace of powder through the room. Isabelle smiled softly. The studio was theirs again, his and hers, and for the first time in months, it felt alive. In a gilded salon on Rue de la Paix, the city's elite gathered under crystal chandeliers that trembled with reflected candlelight. It was a night meant to celebrate art, society, and the resilience of Paris after a decade of war and unrest. Long tables groaned under the weight of roast pheasants, crusted terrines, and silver platters glistening with fruit. The air smelled of brandy, perfume, and polished wood. On the surface, it was a feast of abundance, laughter spilling, glasses raised, music playing from a hidden quartet. But beneath the gold and finery, the celebration carried a hollow resonance. The hosts, two sisters from a family once renowned for salons that drew painters, writers, and poets, moved between guests, ensuring every plate was full and every hand clasped. Yet even they spoke in muted tones about the absence around them. "He hasn't returned," one whispered, glancing at a chair left empty by a painter who had succumbed weeks ago to the White Muse. "And she," the other trailed off, thinking of the actress found lifeless in her dressing room. Each missing guest left a shadow, a reminder that the city's brilliance was built on fragile, fleeting lives. The guests themselves were cautious in their revelry. Aristocrats nibbled delicately, careful not to spill anything on their gowns. Dancers kept their voices soft, murmuring behind gloved hands. Many had begun to embrace the powder themselves, subtle doses taken in the corners of rooms, in back stairwells, beneath the flickering candlelight. It was the new etiquette to appear untouched while secretly drifting, the outward mask of laughter concealing trembling hands and hollowed eyes. Paris had learned to celebrate as if nothing were wrong, to toast survival while ignoring the ever-present shadow of loss. Conversations orbited around art, politics, and the occasional scandal, but always in whispers, as though loud speech would draw the muse closer. A painter spoke of a canvas he could never finish, a poem half-written in tremor. A dancer recounted nights where the stage had felt both heavy and light, her body sustaining brilliance through the careful mediation of a hidden vial. Guests nodded politely, their smiles taut, their eyes wary. They had seen enough to know that the city's brilliance had a price one paid in silence and absence. As the evening deepened, the candles began to gutter, their light flickering across the gold leaf and crystal. Shadows lengthened along the walls, pooling around the empty chairs. The quartet played on, though the music now seemed like a requiem, slow and mournful beneath the hum of polite conversation. Servants moved silently, clearing plates and refilling glasses, their faces pale under the reflection of the chandeliers. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, crawling through the streets and alleys, carrying the faint scent of powder and exhalation. By the time the guests departed, the feast remained. Untouched platters, half-drunk glasses, and candles burned low. In the quiet, the salon seemed to breathe on its own, a living monument to the city's beauty and its decay. The sisters locked the doors, pausing a moment to listen for the absent voices of those who had once filled the room. The hollow feast had ended, but its ghosts lingered, waiting for the next night when Paris would gather again, celebrating brilliance, while the White Muse watched silently, patient and unrelenting. By the winter of 1929, St. Anne Hospital had become something unrecognizable. It was no longer a place of healing, but a fortress of despair, a repository for the forgotten, the addicted, and the quietly dying. The wards that once smelled of antiseptic and hope now reeked of ether, sweat, and faint decay. Nurses moved like ghosts, their faces pale behind masks, their hands trembling from exhaustion or the small doses they carried to steady themselves. The hospital's halls echoed not with the sound of recovery, but with coughs, sighs, and the soft whispering of patients who had already surrendered to the White Muse. The heroin wards overflowed. Beds were crammed 3 to a room, curtains pulled tight, patients propped upright by pillows or each other. Physicians, once diligent, had grown mechanical, administering doses with the precision of accountants rather than healers. "Another pinch for rest," they murmured, counting the powder as though numbers could absolve them of the ruin they witnessed daily. The patients did not fight, nor cry, they simply dissolved into the mattress, their voices low, almost inaudible, like a river retreating from its banks. The collapse was gradual but relentless. Staircases groaned under the weight of the infirm. Elevators groaned and often failed, leaving attendants to carry bodies up and down flights of stairs. The morgue became insufficient for the daily intake, drawers overflowing, corridors lined with temporary cots. Families ceased visiting, letters arrived unopened, accumulating dust and sorrow. For those with no relatives, candles were lit nightly, each a fragile witness to lives quietly evaporating. Even the staff began to fall. Some nurses developed tremors from repeated exposure to the fumes. Junior doctors whispered about colleagues who had taken the powder themselves, claiming they only sought to understand the patient's relief. By March, the hospital had a reputation among locals not for care, but for endurance. Residents along Rue de Sèvres spoke in hushed tones of the screaming that occasionally carried down the street. The windows fogged from unrelieved breaths, the doors that could not contain the smell of medication, sweat, and fading life. The administration tried reforms, issuing new protocols, reducing patient loads, increasing oversight. They were ignored or circumvented. There were too many patients, too few hands, and a system that depended on silence. The White Muse had penetrated even these walls. Heroin was both medicine and menace. Those in power knew the consequences, but were powerless against the combination of demand, addiction, and bureaucracy. One night, a fire broke out in the East Wing. No one was hurt, though smoke filled the corridors and sent attendants coughing. When the blaze was extinguished, windows had melted, mattresses scorched, and the air smelled heavier than before. Some whispered that it was the city's anger, others that it was divine judgment. In truth, it was a symbol. St. Anne had already collapsed in every way that mattered. The structure still stood, the roof still held against the frost, but the life within it had surrendered long before to powder, to neglect, and to the quiet inevitability of Paris itself. By dawn, the streets outside were silent. Snow fell softly along the boulevards, muffling the city. Inside St. Anne, the patients slept, or what passed for it, their bodies propped and still, their souls suspended between consciousness and oblivion. The hospital had become more than a building. It was a monument to addiction, a cathedral of despair, and a testament to the city's complicity in the quiet, unending collapse. The Rue de la Paix was quiet that morning, its cobblestones wet with frost and the faint residue of last night's rain. The fashion houses had drawn their shutters, the gilded window displays empty, and the posters of this season's gowns removed with meticulous care. Today, Paris mourned not a person, but an era. It was a funeral for fashion itself, the brilliance that had once glittered in every salon, every atelier, every stage, now reduced to shadows and whispers. The street was lined with carriages, black and polished, their wheels echoing softly in the chill. Inside, The attendees sat stiff and silent, wrapped in furs and heavy wool, their faces pale under the dim morning light. Among them were couturiers, models, seamstresses, and designers who had survived the decade but witnessed too many vanishings to celebrate. Their hands clutched gloves and programs, their lips pressed together, their eyes betraying the emptiness behind elegance. The coffin at the front, unadorned, yet polished, contained neither a body nor a celebrity. It held instead a single dress, the final creation of a designer who had perished weeks before, her death attributed to exhaustion, though Paris knew it was powder that had claimed her. The priest spoke softly, his voice echoing against the stone walls of the church that had been chosen for its discreet location. He did not preach salvation or redemption. Instead, he spoke of beauty as ephemeral, of brilliance as fleeting, and of the cost exacted by obsession. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow and smoke through the open doors. The attendees listened, not for comfort, but for affirmation of the reality they had long suspected. The world they had known, the elegance they had cultivated, was gone. Models in their final fittings stood near the walls, silent, their gowns hanging like ghosts of silk. Seamstresses bowed their heads, recalling nights spent sewing for clients who had already disappeared into apartments thick with candlelight and the white muse. Photographers had left cameras outside, unwilling to capture what could not be framed. Even the musicians who played a soft requiem on violin and piano seemed subdued, their notes trembling in the cold air, as if uncertain whether music could honor what had been lost. Among the mourners, whispers drifted like smoke. She never finished the hymn. He fell asleep at the wheel of creation. The atelier will be empty now, for who remains? Each statement was met with silence. Paris had stopped asking why, it only noted absence. The city's obsession with beauty, speed, and sensation had left a trail of ghosts that now gathered formally in the streets, clothed in mourning and restraint. When the service ended, the coffin was carried slowly through the streets. Onlookers, who were neither invited nor connected to the deceased, bowed their heads as it passed, their breath rising in clouds of frost. Candles flickered along windowsills, unlit, in most cases, yet still suggested the presence of memory. The carriages rolled onward, the snow softening the echoes, and Paris exhaled quietly, as if acknowledging the finality of the age it had helped destroy. By evening, the street was empty. The dress remained in the atelier, untouched and pristine, a relic of elegance, sacrificed to addiction, ambition, and the inexorable passage of time. The city, cloaked in winter, continued to move forward, but the ghosts lingered, drifting silently along Rue de la Paix, carrying the memory of fashion's brilliance and the toll it had exacted through the fog of Paris's streets. The room was small, the windows frosted with the early chill of November. It smelled faintly of lavender, candle wax, and the lingering perfume of last night's guests. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed, her dress draped over her knees like a shroud. Marguerite St. Clair, a woman whose name had once lit up the posters along the boulevards and filled the cafes of Montparnasse with whispers of admiration, now seemed almost transparent, as if the city itself had begun to pull her inside its grey fog. Her hands trembled, and her pulse was faint beneath the thin fabric of her gloves. On the small table beside her lay a silver spoon, a vial of white powder, and a candle whose flame quivered in the cold. This had become ritual not for pleasure, not for relief, but for survival. The first dose was always the gentlest, a soft exhalation that calmed the heartbeat and muted the tremor. The next would be stronger, the next stronger still. Paris had taught her the rhythm: inhale, exhale, fade. And tonight, she knew she would take the final step. The last dose. She thought of the letters that would never be sent, the friends who had vanished into the city's shadow, the cafes that had emptied before dawn, leaving only the scent of smoke and despair. She thought of her reflection in the mirror, a woman she barely recognized, eyes hollow, lips pale, the skin of her cheeks stretched thin from sleepless nights and powders that promised eternity. She had once believed in art, in laughter, in love. Now, she believed only in this final release. The candlelight flickered against the walls as she measured the powder, the tiniest fraction that would carry her beyond the ache of existence. Her fingers, steady for the first time in months, lifted the spoon to her lips. She inhaled, slowly, deeply, as though she could draw the city's sorrow into herself and carry it all at once. The warmth spread, gentle at first, and then insistent, a quiet rush that silenced thought, memory, fear. Her heartbeat slowed, the tremors ceased, the pain softened to a whisper. Outside, Paris continued its restless pace. Trams rumbled along the boulevards, streetlights glimmered through mist. The cafes hummed faintly with voices and music. No one noticed that, in a narrow room above Rue de la Fontaine, one of the city's brightest lights was fading. She lay back against the pillow, eyes half closed, body perfectly still. The spoon rested on the table, the candle guttered low, the powder scattered like snow. When morning came, the room was empty, silent. No one entered, no one found her until later. The newspapers would print a brief notice: young actress found deceased, cause unknown. Paris would shrug and move on, unaware of the ritual she had performed, unaware that the city had claimed yet another life quietly, beautifully, without spectacle. And somewhere along the Seine, the reflection of the dawn trembled. Paris exhaled, and in that pause, the white muse drifted softly through the streets, waiting for the next body, the next hand, the next soul willing to follow her into oblivion. The last dose had been taken, and yet her presence remained, patient, eternal, unstoppable. By the early hours of the morning, the music had stopped. The saxophones, the violins, the distant pianos, all were silent, their echoes lingering faintly in the fog that wrapped around Montmartre like a shroud. The cafes and cabarets, once alive with laughter, argument, and the fevered conversation of artists and dreamers, now stood empty. Chairs were overturned, cigarette butts lay scattered across damp wooden floors, and the faint scent of powder clung stubbornly to the air. Paris exhaled into the quiet, a city finally still, though not at peace. The patrons had gone home, or to rooms above the cafes, or to beds that were no longer their own. Many would not wake. Some drifted in that peculiar liminal space between consciousness and oblivion, where the white muse held them in gentle thrall, their minds flickering between dream and memory. Those who remained upright shuffled through the streets, eyes half-lidded, hands trembling, breath shallow. The music had been a shield, a mask, a rhythm that held the city together for just a few hours. Without it, Paris seemed exposed, stripped to its raw, quiet despair. In one small studio on Rue de la Grande Chaumière, a painter sat in near darkness, brush in hand, staring at an unfinished canvas. The colors had once burned with brilliance, but now they lay dull and heavy, smeared by a hand that no longer trembled with inspiration, but with exhaustion. His assistant, pale and silent, leaned against the doorframe, eyes wide, refusing to speak. Both of them had been alive to see the jazz echo through the streets, to feel the energy of Montparnasse in the form of music and light. Now they were only shadows, tracing the edges of a world they no longer fully inhabited. On the boulevard below, a dancer walked alone. Her slippers, worn thin, made no sound against the cobblestones slick with rain. She had left the cabaret hours before, her body spent, her mind already drifting. Her powder was gone, the music had faded, and all that remained was the hollow echo of applause in memory. She stopped at a corner, gazed at the street lamp, and whispered a name that no one would hear. Paris was listening, but it offered no comfort. Even the river seemed subdued. The Seine flowed dark and smooth, reflecting the faint glow of lamps that pierced the fog, but its surface carried no laughter, no movement. Boats that had carried pleasure and escape drifted unmanned, moored quietly against the quay. Somewhere beneath the water, the remnants of yesterday's powder dissolved into currents, invisible yet persistent, mingling with the city's breath in silence. By sunrise, Montmartre had learned a new rhythm, one without music, without fever, without distraction. The streets were empty save for the wind and the occasional courier or street cleaner. The city held its breath, not in celebration, but in mourning for what it had lost. The vibrancy, the energy, the light that had carried the living through the night. And above it all, the white muse drifted silently, patient and eternal, her presence woven into the fog, the river, the cobblestones. She had claimed the night, and now Paris waited for her return. The silence after jazz was not peaceful. It was a warning, a reminder that the city's heart had slowed, and that the dream of life had become indistinguishable from the quiet of the dead. The streets of Paris woke slowly that morning, their cobblestones slick with frost and the faint residue of a fog that had not lifted. Sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the mist, illuminating the facades of Montmartre, Saint-Germain, and the left bank. Yet even in this clarity, the city felt smaller, thinner, as if the air itself had been drained. The cafes were open, but their patrons were fewer. The theatres waited for performances that would never carry the same brilliance. And in every corner, in every alley, in the quiet of rooms above shuttered salons, the white muse lingered. Her shadow was long, silent, and patient. The city's survivors moved among her presence without acknowledging it. Painters still arranged their palettes, though the colors no longer shimmered. Poets scribbled words that dissolved in trembling hands. Dancers tied their slippers, ready for rehearsals that lacked the energy of true inspiration. They had survived the decade of powder, of fevered creativity, of disappearance, but they were hollowed. Paris had consumed them as much as it had consumed its own rivers, its Seine now flowing heavy with forgotten remnants, dissolving into currents of memory, loss, and chemical residue. In Montparnasse, a café opened its doors at dawn. Candles, still burning low, reflected in the fogged windows. Inside, a few patrons huddled over coffee, their hands shaking from the absence of the powder that had been their guide through the night. Conversations were cautious, measured. Laughter, when it arose, was brittle. Outside, the streets were quiet, except for the distant hum of trams and the occasional cart scraping against wet stones. The city had learned to move slowly now, as if mindful of the lives it had already lost. The hospitals, too, remained. Sainte-Anne and Saint-Lazare stood like monuments to a period of quiet devastation. Their corridors still carried the faint scent of ether and antiseptic, the whispers of nurses long, accustomed to the dying. The patients who remained were the shadows of those who had been lost, hollowed figures tracing the edges of rooms, silent witnesses to their own survival. In every drawer, in every vial, in every candle flickering against frosted glass, the white muse left her mark. And yet, despite everything, Paris endured. Life continued in small, fragile ways. A painter finished a canvas, a poet remembered a verse, a dancer rose to her toes for rehearsal. The city still laughed and whispered, celebrated and mourned, danced and wrote. But beneath the surface, in the currents of the Seine, in the quiet of the ateliers, in the frost that crept along window-sills, the white muse remained. Her presence was not terrifying, nor cruel, nor joyous. It was inevitable, patient, eternal, a shadow that Paris had welcomed, feared, and could never fully expel. As the sun climbed higher, reflecting off the rooftops and spilling over the boulevards, the city exhaled. And in that exhalation, one could almost feel the pulse of all it had lost and all it had preserved. The powder, the whisper, the fevered inspiration, they were gone, yet they had left their imprint. The white muse had claimed what she would, but she had also taught the city a dangerous truth. Brilliance and oblivion were inseparable. And so, in the streets, the cafes, the studios, and the theatres, the shadow remained quiet, patient, eternal, and Paris moved on, forever changed, forever haunted, forever dreaming.